My parents forced me to share my inheritance. My grandfather's lawyer had other plans. Part Y. The Bequest. Chapter 1. The Call. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, when the maple trees lining Westbrook Avenue had just begun to shed their crimson leaves. I was in the middle of grading midterm papers for my sophomore literature class when my phone buzzed against the coffee-stained coaster on my desk. Unknown number. Normally, I'd have let it go to voicemail, but something, intuition perhaps, made me pick up. "Hello, is this James Harrington?" The voice was crisp, professional. Speaking. "This is Margaret Winters from the law offices of Blackwell Winters and Associates. I'm calling regarding the estate of Harold Harrington. I understand he was your grandfather." My hand tightened around the phone. Grandpa Harry had passed away 3 weeks ago after a brief battle with pneumonia that his 92-year-old body simply couldn't fight. The funeral had been small, solemn, just as he would have wanted. "Yes, he was," I said, my voice catching slightly. Despite our 32-year age gap, Grandpa Harry had been more than just a grandfather to me. After my parents divorced when I was 11, and both became consumed with their own lives and new families, it was Grandpa Harry who showed up to my baseball games, who taught me to drive in his old Ford pickup, who helped me move into my first apartment after college. "Mr. Harrington, we're handling your grandfather's will, and we need you to come to our office at your earliest convenience. There are matters regarding his estate that require your immediate attention." I frowned. As far as I knew, Grandpa Harry had lived modestly. His small house in Burlington had been paid off decades ago, and aside from his collection of first-edition novels and some antique fishing gear, I wasn't aware of any significant assets he possessed. "Is there a problem?" I asked. "Not at all," Ms. Winters replied. "But these matters are best discussed in person. Would tomorrow at 10 a.m. work for you?" I glanced at my calendar. I had a class at 11, but the law office was only a 15-minute drive from campus. "I can make that work," I said. "Excellent. Our office is located at 1425 Oakmont Street, Suite 300. Mr. Blackwell himself will be handling this matter." After ending the call, I sat back in my chair, staring at the stack of papers before me but no longer seeing them. Grandpa Harry and I had been close, but we'd never discussed his will or any inheritance. The one time I'd brought it up, about a year ago when his health had first begun to decline, he'd waved it away with characteristic nonchalance. "Don't you worry about that nonsense, Jamie," he'd said, using the childhood nickname that only he was still allowed to use. "Everything will be taken care of when the time comes." I picked up my phone again and called my mother. "Mom, did you know Grandpa Harry had a lawyer?" I asked after exchanging brief pleasantries. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Why do you ask?" I explained about the call from Ms. Winters. My mother's response was immediate and predictable. "Oh, that must be about the house. I suppose he left it to you?" "That makes sense. You were always his favorite." There was no bitterness in her tone, just a statement of fact. My mother and her father had maintained a cordial but distant relationship after she left Burlington for Chicago with her second husband. "I don't know what it's about," I said honestly. "I'm meeting with the lawyer tomorrow morning." "Well, let me know what happens. And James," she added, her voice softening slightly, "whatever it is, I'm glad he thought of you." After hanging up, I tried to return to my grading, but my mind kept wandering. What could be so important that Mr. Blackwell himself needed to speak with me? The name sounded vaguely familiar, but I couldn't place it. That evening, I found myself browsing through old photo albums, stopping at images of Grandpa Harry throughout. The years, standing proudly next to his bookstore in the 1970s, fishing with me at Lake Champlain when I was maybe 8 or 9, sitting in his favorite armchair at Christmas 5 years ago, wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose as he read aloud from A Christmas Carol, a tradition he'd maintained since before I was born. The memories brought both comfort and grief, and I eventually fell asleep on the couch, an album still open on my lap. Morning came too quickly. I woke with a stiff neck, showered hastily, and dressed in what I hoped was appropriate attire for meeting with a lawyer: dark jeans and a navy blazer over a button-down shirt. Professional enough without looking like I was trying too hard. The law offices of Blackwell, Winters and Associates occupied the third floor of a red brick building in downtown Burlington. The reception area was elegant but understated, with leather chairs and framed black and white photographs of Vermont landscapes. "Mr. Harrington?" The receptionist looked up as I approached her desk. "Mr. Blackwell is expecting you. Please, follow me." She led me down a carpeted hallway to a corner office with a polished oak door. The nameplate read Edward Blackwell, Senior Partner. She knocked once, then opened the door. "James Harrington to see you, sir." The man who rose from behind the massive desk wasn't what I'd expected. In my mind, I'd pictured someone older, perhaps of my grandfather's generation. But Edward Blackwell appeared to be in his mid-50s, with salt and pepper hair and sharp blue eyes behind tortoiseshell glasses. His handshake was firm as he gestured for me to take a seat. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Harrington. I'm very sorry for your loss. Your grandfather was an exceptional man." "Thank you," I replied automatically, then paused. "Did you know him well?" Blackwell's expression softened slightly. "I did, yes. I was not only his attorney for the past 30 years, but also counted him as a friend. We shared a passion for literature and fishing, though I'm afraid I never matched his skill at either pursuit." The comment caught me off guard. This man had been friends with my grandfather for decades, yet I'd never heard his name mentioned. It struck me how little I actually knew about Grandpa Harry's life outside of our relationship. "Now," Blackwell continued, opening a leather portfolio on his desk, "let's discuss why you're here. As you know, your grandfather passed away 3 weeks ago. What you may not know is that Harold was a very methodical, forward-thinking man. He came to see me approximately 6 months ago to finalize his will and make certain arrangements." My brow furrowed. "Arrangements?" "Indeed." Blackwell removed a sealed envelope from the portfolio and slid it across the desk. "First, he asked me to give you this. He was quite specific that you should read it privately before we proceed further." I took the envelope, turning it over. In my hands, my name was written on the front in Grandpa Harry's distinctive, slightly shaky handwriting. "You're welcome to use my office," Blackwell said, standing. "I'll give you a few minutes alone." After he left, I stared at the envelope for a long moment before carefully breaking the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, dated April 15th of that year. "My dear Jamie, if you're reading this, then I've finally run out of stories to tell. Don't be sad. At 92, I'd say I've had more than my fair share of chapters. You've always been special to me, not just because you're my grandson, but because of who you are. Your kindness, your integrity, your passion for literature and learning. You remind me of myself at your age, though I hope you've been wiser in your choices than I sometimes was. I've never been one to talk about money or possessions. As you know, I've always believed that a person's worth lies in their character, not their bank account. However, there are some things you should know. Throughout my life, I made some investments that turned out rather well. The bookstore was just the beginning. While I've lived simply by choice, I've been fortunate in my financial affairs. I've instructed Edward, who has been a trusted friend and advisor for many years, to explain everything in detail. Listen carefully to him. He knows my wishes and will guide you through what might seem overwhelming at first. One last thing, Jamie. You may face some pressure from family members in the coming days. Remember that what I've left to you is yours, and yours alone. Trust your instincts, and trust Edward. I'm proud of the man you've become, and I have every confidence in the man you will continue to be. All my love, Grandpa Harry. I read the letter twice more, a strange mixture of emotions washing over me. Grief at the finality of it. Confusion about what he meant by pressure from family members. And something else. A growing suspicion that this meeting was about much more than just a modest house and some personal effects. When Blackwell returned, he must have read something in my expression. Did the letter provide some context? He asked, resuming his seat. I nodded, folding the paper carefully and returning it to the envelope. Some, yes, but I still don't understand what this is all about. Blackwell steepled his fingers. Let me be direct, Mr. Harrington. Your grandfather was a wealthy man, very wealthy, in fact. I blinked. That's not possible. He ran a small bookstore. He lived in the same house for 50 years. He drove a 20-year-old truck. All true, Blackwell acknowledged. Harold valued simplicity and never saw the need for ostentation. But he was also an astute businessman and investor. The bookstore was profitable, yes, but it was his investments in real estate and, later, in technology, stocks that built his fortune. He was an early investor in several companies that have since become household names. My mind was reeling. How much are we talking about? The total value of his estate, including liquid assets, investments, real estate holdings, and personal property, is approximately $47 million. The room seemed to tilt slightly. I gripped the arms of my chair. That's impossible. I assure you it's quite accurate, Blackwell replied calmly, as if he hadn't just upended my entire understanding of my grandfather's life. And according to the terms of his will, you are the sole beneficiary. Chapter 2. The Revelation. $47 million. The number kept repeating in my head as I drove back to my apartment, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles had turned white. $47 million. My grandfather, the man who mended his own clothes, who clipped coupons from the Sunday paper, who had taught me the value of saving for a rainy day, had been a multimillionaire. I'd left Blackwell's office with a thick folder of documents, a promise to return later in the week to sign the necessary paperwork, and a spinning head. According to Blackwell, the inheritance process would be relatively straightforward since Grandpa Harry had meticulously planned everything. There would be taxes, of course, but the bulk of the estate would pass to me intact. Take some time to process this, Blackwell had advised as I'd gathered my things to leave. It's a lot to absorb. And James, he'd added, using my first name, for the first time, your grandfather was very explicit about his wishes. This inheritance is yours. Remember that. His words echoed Grandpa Harry's letter. What I've left to you is yours, and yours alone. But why the emphasis? Why would they both feel the need to stress this point? I was so distracted that I nearly missed the turnoff to my apartment complex. Once inside, I dropped the folder on my kitchen table and made myself a cup of strong coffee, trying to gather my thoughts. My phone buzzed, a text from my mother. How did the meeting go? I stared at the message, unsure how to respond. Should I tell her about the inheritance? Grandpa Harry's letter had mentioned potential pressure from family members, which suggested he anticipated some conflict. But keeping such significant news from my own mother felt wrong. Before I could decide, my phone rang. Mom again. Hi, Mom, I answered, my voice carefully neutral. James, you never texted me back. What happened with the lawyer? I took a deep breath. It was unexpected. Grandpa Harry left me his house and some money. There was a pause. How much money? The direct question left me little room to evade. A significant amount, I hedged. James. Her tone sharpened. I'm your mother. How much? $47 million, I said quickly, like ripping off a bandage. The silence that followed was profound. When my mother finally spoke, her voice had changed entirely. $47 million? That's That's not possible. Dad didn't have that kind of money. That's what I said, but apparently he made some wise investments over the years. And he left it all to you? Nothing for me or your sister? Nothing for your father? I winced at the hurt and indignation in her voice. Mom, I was as surprised as you are. I had no idea. I need to call your father, she interrupted. And Melissa. We need to discuss this as a family. Mom, wait! But she had already hung up. I set the phone down, a knot forming in my stomach. This was exactly what Grandpa Harry had warned me about. And now, it was beginning. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of phone calls, texts, and increasingly tense conversations. My mother had indeed called my father, Richard, who now lived in Florida with his third wife. Despite their divorce 15 years earlier, my parents maintained occasional contact, primarily regarding matters concerning my younger half-sister, Melissa. By Wednesday evening, I had received calls from both my father and Melissa, each expressing a mixture of shock, disbelief, and what I could only interpret as thinly veiled expectation. I just don't understand why Dad would do this, my mother had repeated during our second call. It's not fair to the rest of the family. Jamie, buddy, my father had said, his voice carrying that forced joviality he used when trying to persuade someone. You always were the responsible one. I know you'll do right by everyone. Melissa had been more direct. So, are you going to share it? I mean, that's the right thing to do, isn't it? I'd avoided making any commitments, telling them all that I needed time to process everything and sort out the legal aspects first. But their messages had grown more frequent and insistent. On Thursday morning, as I was preparing for my 9 a.m. class, my phone rang again. Expecting another family member, I was surprised to see Edward Blackwell's name on the screen. Mr. Blackwell, I answered. I was planning to come by tomorrow to sign those papers. That's fine, James, but I'm actually calling about another matter. Are you free for dinner this evening? There are some additional aspects of your grandfather's estate that we need to discuss, and I think a more informal setting might be appropriate. Something in his tone made me curious. Is everything all right with the inheritance? Perfectly all right, he assured me. Just some details Harold asked me to share with you privately. The Overlook restaurant at 7 p.m., my treat, of course. I agreed, my curiosity piqued. What else could there possibly be to discuss? The remainder of the day passed slowly. My students must have noticed my distraction during lectures, but I managed to maintain some semblance of professionalism. Between classes, I received 3 more texts from my mother, 2 from Melissa, and 1 from my father, all essentially asking the same question. When would we discuss how the inheritance would be shared? The Overlook restaurant sat on a hill, just outside Burlington, offering panoramic views of Lake Champlain. It was upscale without being pretentious, exactly the kind of place Grandpa Harry would have appreciated. Blackwell was already seated when I arrived, nursing what looked like a scotch on the rocks. He stood to greet me, gesturing to the chair across from him. James, thank you for coming. I took the liberty of ordering a bottle of Macallan 18, your grandfather's favorite. I nodded in appreciation as a waiter approached with a second glass. He introduced me to single malts on my 21st birthday. Said if I was going to drink, I should at least develop a palate for the good stuff. Blackwell smiled, a genuine expression that softened his professional demeanor. That sounds like Harold. He never did believe in doing things halfway. After we'd ordered our meals, steak for Blackwell, salmon for me, he leaned forward slightly. I imagine the past couple of days have been rather overwhelming for you, he said. I gave a short, humorless laugh. That's putting it mildly. Finding out about the inheritance was shocking enough, but dealing with my family's reactions has been... I trailed off, unsure how to characterize the increasing pressure I'd been feeling. Challenging? Blackwell suggested. To say the least. They all seem to think the money should be divided equally among the family. My mother especially feels she's entitled to a significant portion. Blackwell nodded, as if this news didn't surprise him in the least. And how do you feel about that? I took a sip of scotch, letting the smoky liquid linger on my tongue as I considered the question. Honestly, I don't know. On one hand, $47 million is an enormous amount of money, more than I could spend in a lifetime. Sharing it seems reasonable. But on the other hand, I hesitated. On the other hand, it was your grandfather's money to distribute as he saw fit, Blackwell finished for me. And he chose you as his sole beneficiary. Yes, and both you and Grandpa Harry emphasize that the inheritance is mine alone. I keep wondering why you both felt the need to stress that point. Blackwell studied me for a moment before reaching into his jacket pocket and withdrawing a small flash drive. He placed it on the table between us. Your grandfather recorded this about 4 months ago. He asked me to give it to you if your family began to pressure you about the inheritance. I believe now is the appropriate time. I stared at the small device. What's on it? A video message. Harold was very specific about you watching it alone. I've taken the liberty of booking a private dining room for us this evening. After dinner, I'll leave you to view it in privacy. The meal that followed was pleasant enough, with Blackwell sharing stories about my grandfather that I'd never heard before, how they'd met at a rare book auction in Boston, their annual fishing trips to a remote lake in northern Maine, the time Grandpa Harry had talked Blackwell out of a disastrous investment in the late 90s. Your grandfather had remarkable intuition about people and opportunities, Blackwell explained as we finished our dessert. He could see value where others couldn't, and he could spot a bad deal or a dishonest person from a mile away. Once coffee had been served, Blackwell excused himself, leaving me alone with a laptop he'd brought specifically for me to view. The flash drive's contents. With slightly shaking hands, I inserted the drive and opened the single video file it contained. Grandpa Harry's face filled the screen, recorded in what I recognized as his study. He looked thin, but alert, his blue eyes still sharp behind his glasses. Jamie, he began, his familiar voice sending a wave of grief through me. If you're watching this, then 2 things have happened. I'm gone, and your family is making noise about my money. He chuckled, a dry sound that turned into a brief cough. I want to explain my decision to leave everything to you, and only you. It wasn't made lightly or without consideration. You see, Jamie, money has a way of revealing who people truly are. Throughout my life, I've seen it bring out both the best and worst in those around me. Your mother, my daughter, made her choices long ago. When she left Burlington after her divorce from Richard, she made it clear that her new life didn't have much room for her old father. The occasional phone call, the obligatory Christmas visit every few years. That's not a relationship, Jamie. That's obligation. As for Richard, well, you know better than most what kind of father he's been to you. When the coaching and baseball games and school projects became inconvenient, he moved on to his new family. And Melissa, I bear her no ill will, but we've met perhaps 5 times in her entire life. You were different when everyone else was too busy. You made time for an old man. You listened to my stories. You helped when my health began to fail. You showed up, Jamie. Not for what you might get, but simply because that's who you are. Now, I suspect they're telling you that sharing the money is the right thing to do. They'll play on your sense of fairness and family loyalty. They may even try to make you feel guilty for having what they think they deserve. Here's what I want you to understand. This money represents my life's work, my choices, my sacrifices. I earned the right to decide where it goes after I'm gone. And I chose you not just because you're my grandson, but because I trust you to use it wisely. So remember what I taught you. Generosity should come from the heart, not from obligation or guilt. If you decide, of your own free will, to help your family in some way, that's your choice. But don't let anyone pressure you into giving away what is rightfully yours. Trust Edward. He's been my friend for many years and knows my wishes. He also has a few more surprises for you. Good ones, I promise. I love you, Jamie. Live well, be happy, and for God's sake, buy yourself a decent car. That Japanese tin can you drive offends my sensibilities. The video ended with Grandpa Harry's familiar crooked smile. I sat in silence, tears running down my face, feeling both the acute pain of his loss and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. When Blackwell returned 20 minutes later, I had composed myself somewhat. He took one look at my face and nodded in understanding. He was a remarkable man, Blackwell said simply. Yes, he was. I tucked the flash drive into my pocket. He mentioned you have more surprises for me? Blackwell smiled. Indeed I do, but those can wait until our meeting tomorrow. For now, I suggest you go home and get some rest. The coming days may require all your strength. His words proved prophetic. When I returned to my apartment that night, I found my mother waiting outside my door. Chapter 3. The Ultimatum. Mom, what are you doing here? I asked, fumbling, with my keys as she rose from where she'd been sitting against my apartment door. I hadn't expected to see her in person. She lived in Chicago, a good 12-hour drive away. You weren't answering my calls, she said, smoothing her skirt. She looked tired, with dark circles under her eyes that her carefully applied makeup couldn't quite conceal. I caught the first flight out this morning. I unlocked the door and gestured for her to enter, my mind racing. This was not a conversation I was prepared to have tonight, not after watching Grandpa Harry's video message, which was still fresh and raw in my mind. My apartment was modest, a one-bedroom on the outskirts of Burlington that suited my needs as a single professor. The living room served dual purpose as my office, with bookshelves lining one wall and a desk tucked into the corner. My mother looked around with barely disguised disapproval. You could afford something nicer than this now, she remarked, settling onto my worn couch. Especially with $47 million. I sighed, hanging my keys on the hook by the door. Mom, it's late, and I've had a long day. Can we talk about this tomorrow? She folded her hands in her lap, a gesture I recognized from childhood. It meant she wasn't going anywhere until she got what she wanted. I've flown halfway across the country to see you, James. I think you can spare a few minutes for your mother. I relented, sitting in the armchair across from her. Fine. What do you want to talk about? You know perfectly well what we need to discuss. Your grandfather's money. The fact that he apparently left his entire fortune to you without consideration for the rest of his family. It was his money, I said quietly. He had the right to leave it to whomever he chose. Her expression hardened slightly. Your grandfather wasn't thinking clearly toward the end. You know how elderly people can get? Confused, easily influenced. The implication stung. Are you suggesting I somehow manipulated Grandpa Harry into leaving me his money? Because I didn't even know it existed until 3 days ago. I'm not saying you did anything wrong, James, she backpedaled. But you were there, in Burlington. You saw him regularly. The rest of us didn't have that opportunity. That was your choice, Mom. You moved to Chicago. You chose not to visit more than once every few years. A flash of anger crossed her face. Don't you dare make me the villain here. I had my own life to live, my own family to take care of. And I was part of that family, I reminded her. But after you remarried, I spent more time with Grandpa Harry than I did with you. She flinched as if I'd slapped her. That's not fair. Isn't it? You're sitting here claiming entitlement to Grandpa Harry's money when you barely spoke to him, in the last decade of his life. He was my father, she said, her voice rising. Of course I'm entitled to something. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Mom, I understand this is a shock. It was for me, too. But the will is clear. Grandpa, Harry left everything to me. Wills can be contested, she said coldly. I stared at her, momentarily speechless. Are you threatening to take me to court over this? If that's what it takes to ensure a fair distribution, yes. Your father agrees with me, by the way. We've been discussing our options. The revelation that my parents were unified on this front was surprising, but not entirely unexpected. Money had a way of creating strange alliances. You'd sue your own son? Don't be dramatic, James. We're simply talking about what's fair. Your grandfather's estate should benefit the entire family, not just you. Surely you can see that. I stood up, suddenly too agitated to remain seated. What I see is that everyone is suddenly very interested in Grandpa Harry's money now that he's gone. Where was this family unity when he was alive and lonely? My mother rose as well, her face flushed. I didn't come here to be lectured by my own son. I came to propose a solution that works for everyone. And what solution is that? A fair division. 1/3 to you, 1/3 to me, and 1/3 to be divided between your father and Melissa. I almost laughed at the audacity. You want me to just hand over 2/3 of my inheritance? Just like that? It's not just your inheritance, she insisted. It's family money that should have been distributed fairly in the first place. It's exactly my inheritance, I countered, legally and morally. Grandpa Harry made his choices, for his own reasons. My mother's expression turned calculating. James, I don't think you understand the position you're in. If we contest the will, this could drag on for years. Legal fees, court appearances, family testimony. It would be messy and public. Your reputation at the university could be affected. Is that really what you want? The threat was thinly veiled but clear. Are you blackmailing me? I'm being practical. No one wins in a prolonged legal battle. This way, everyone gets something and we avoid unnecessary conflict. I walked to the door and opened it. I think you should leave now, Mom. We're both tired, and this conversation isn't productive. James, please, just go. I need time to think. She gathered her purse, her movements stiff with anger. At the door, she paused. We're not going away, James. One way or another, this will be resolved fairly. I've booked a room at the Hilton downtown. I expect to hear from you tomorrow with a reasonable response. After she left, I leaned against the closed door, my head pounding. The evening had gone from contemplative to confrontational in a matter of minutes. My mother's ultimatum hung in the air: share the inheritance voluntarily, or face a legal battle that would pit family members against each other in public. I called Blackwell despite the late hour. To my surprise, he answered on the second ring. James, is everything all right? I explained the situation briefly, my mother's surprise visit, her demands, her threats. Blackwell listened without interruption. When I finished, he was silent for a moment before responding. I can't say I'm surprised. Harold anticipated this reaction, which is why he was so careful with his estate planning. As for your mother's threats to contest the will, she's certainly within her rights to try. However, I should mention that Harold took specific measures to discourage such action. What kind of measures? I think it's better if we discuss that in person tomorrow. But for now, rest assured that your grandfather foresaw this situation and made provisions accordingly. Try to get some sleep, James. Tomorrow will be a busy day. After hanging up, I made myself a cup of tea and sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by the documents Blackwell had given me earlier in the week. I hadn't had time to review them thoroughly, having been overwhelmed by the initial revelation and the subsequent family drama. Now, I began to read more carefully, starting with the will itself. The language was dense with legal terminology, but certain passages stood out clearly. I, Harold James Harrington, being of sound mind and memory, do hereby make, publish, and declare this to be my last will and testament, hereby revoking all wills and codicils previously made by me. I give, devise, and bequeath all of my property, real, personal, and mixed, of whatever kind and wherever situated, which I may own or have the right to dispose of at the time of my death, to my grandson, James Richard Harrington. And then, toward the end, a paragraph that caught my attention. Should any beneficiary named in this will or any heir-at-law contest or attack this will or any of its provisions in any manner, directly or indirectly, that person shall forfeit and cease to have any right or interest whatsoever under this will, and shall be deemed to have predeceased me for all purposes of this will. A no contest clause. I wasn't a lawyer, but its meaning seemed clear enough. Anyone who challenged the will would forfeit any benefits they might receive under it. But since my mother, father, and sister weren't named beneficiaries, what did they have to lose by contesting it? Their threats suddenly seemed more substantial. I continued reading through the documents, eventually coming across a folder labeled Trust Documents. Inside was information about something called the Harold J. Harrington Family Trust, established 5 years earlier. According to the summary page, the trust held assets of approximately $5 million and had 4 beneficiaries: my mother, my father, my sister Melissa, and me. Each of us was entitled to a quarterly distribution of income from the trust with the principal to be divided equally upon certain conditions. I frowned, confused. If Grandpa Harry had already set up a substantial trust for the entire family, why were they so intent on claiming a portion of my inheritance? $5 million divided 4 ways was still over $1 million each. Not $47 million, certainly, but hardly an insignificant sum. As I continued reading, the answer became clear. There was a condition attached to the trust. Distributions of principal to any beneficiary shall be contingent upon said beneficiary's acceptance of the terms of my last will and testament without contest or challenge. Grandpa Harry had set a trap. If my mother, father, or sister contested his will leaving the bulk of his estate to me, they would forfeit their share of the family trust. The question now was, did they know about this provision? Had they read the fine print? Or were they operating under the assumption that they had nothing to lose by challenging the will? I closed the folder, my thoughts racing. Tomorrow's meeting with Blackwell took on new significance. If my family was unaware of the trust's conditions, this information could dramatically alter the dynamics of our conflict. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt a glimmer of hope that there might be a resolution that honored Grandpa Harry's wishes without completely alienating my family. I finally went to bed around 2 a.m., exhausted but somewhat calmer. Whatever tomorrow brought, at least I'd be prepared. Chapter 4. The Countermove. I arrived at Blackwell's office promptly at 9 a.m., having barely slept. The receptionist, Lucy, according to her nameplate, greeted me with a smile that seemed warmer than on my previous visit. "Mr. Blackwell is expecting you, Mr. Harrington. Would you like some coffee before you go in?" I accepted gratefully, and she returned moments later with a steaming cup. "Cream, no sugar." "Mr. Blackwell mentioned that's how you take it," she explained, and I wondered what else my grandfather's lawyer knew about me. When I entered Blackwell's office, he was on the phone, but he gestured for me to take a seat as he wrapped up his conversation. "Yes, that's correct. No, I'm afraid that won't be possible. As I explained, the terms are quite explicit." "Very well, do what you must. Goodbye." He hung up with a sigh, removing his glasses to pinch the bridge of his nose. "That was Patricia Simmons," he said, replacing his glasses. "Your mother's attorney." I nearly choked on my coffee. My mother already hired a lawyer? Indeed she did. Apparently they wasted no time. Blackwell didn't seem particularly concerned. "Patricia is competent, but tends to take on cases regardless of their merit if the client can pay her fees." "I found something interesting last night," I said, pulling out the trust documents from my briefcase. About the family trust and the conditions attached to it. Do they know about this? Blackwell's mouth curved into a small smile. I was wondering if you'd discover that. No, they don't know. At least not yet. Your grandfather was very specific about the sequence of events. He wanted you to have time to understand your inheritance before the others learned about the trust. So they're threatening to contest the will without realizing they'd lose their share of the trust if they do? Precisely. Blackwell leaned back in his chair. Harold anticipated their reaction with remarkable accuracy. He knew your mother and father would see the will as unfair and would likely try to pressure you into sharing your inheritance. I shook my head, still trying to process everything. It's like he set up a chess game where he anticipated everyone's moves in advance. Harold was always thinking several steps ahead, Blackwell agreed. Now, before we discuss how to handle your family, there's another matter we need to address. The surprise I mentioned yesterday. He opened a drawer and removed a small, wooden box, about the size of a hardcover book. It was made of polished walnut with my grandfather's initials inlaid in brass on the lid. Harold asked me to give you this once you'd had time to acclimate to the news of your inheritance. He slid the box across the desk. I opened it carefully. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark blue velvet, was an old-fashioned pocket watch. I recognized it immediately. Grandpa Harry had carried it as long as I'd known him. Next to the watch was a small brass key and an envelope with my name on it. The watch was his father's and his grandfather's before that, Blackwell explained as I lifted it gently from the box. It's been in your family for over a century. The watch was heavy in my palm, its gold case warm to the touch. I pressed. The crown and the cover sprung open to reveal the intricate face with Roman numerals. The steady ticking was somehow reassuring. What's the key for? I asked, picking it up. That's for you to discover, Blackwell said with a slight smile. Read the letter first. I opened the envelope and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. Jamie. This watch has marked time for generations of Harrington men. Now it's yours. More than an heirloom, it's a reminder that time is the one commodity money can't buy. Use yours wisely. The key opens something precious to me that I hope will bring you joy. Look where stories live but rarely change. With love and faith in you. Grandpa Harry. I read the brief message several times, trying to decipher the clue. Look where stories live but rarely change. What does that mean? Blackwell shrugged, though something in his expression suggested he knew more than he was letting on. Harold enjoyed his little mysteries. I'm sure you'll figure it out. Now, he continued, his tone becoming more businesslike. Let's discuss how to handle your family. As I see it, we have several options. For the next hour, Blackwell outlined possible approaches. We could immediately inform my mother, father, and sister about the trust and its conditions, effectively calling their bluff. Or we could wait, letting them proceed with their threats until they'd committed themselves to a course of action that would trigger the trust's penalty clause. There's also a third option, Blackwell suggested. You could propose a settlement, something less than what they're demanding, but enough to satisfy them. I frowned. Wouldn't that go against Grandpa Harry's wishes? His letter and video were pretty clear about the inheritance being mine alone. Harold wanted you to have the freedom to make your own decisions, Blackwell clarified. If you choose to share some portion of your inheritance voluntarily, that's your prerogative. What he objected to was you being pressured or manipulated into doing so. I considered this. I don't mind helping my family. I just don't like being threatened or made to feel guilty about an inheritance I never asked for. Understandable. Perhaps there's a middle path, one that honors both your grandfather's intentions and your own values. By the time our meeting concluded, we had developed a strategy. Blackwell would arrange a meeting with my mother and her attorney for Monday morning, 3 days away. In the meantime, I would have the weekend to think about what, if anything, I was willing to offer them. Remember, Blackwell advised as I prepared to leave, you're negotiating from a position of strength. They don't know about the trust provision yet. That gives you leverage. I nodded, tucking the wooden box into my briefcase. I still need to figure out this clue about the key. I suspect the answer is closer than you think, Blackwell said cryptically. I spent the remainder of Friday in a daze, mechanically going through my teaching duties while my mind churned with inheritance issues, family tensions, and the mystery of the brass key. By late afternoon, as I was grading papers in my office, my phone buzzed with a text from my sister. Mom says you're being unreasonable. Call me. I ignored it, focusing instead on Grandpa Harry's clue. Look where stories live, but rarely change. What could that mean? Books, obviously. Stories lived in books. But books changed hands all the time, were borrowed and returned, bought and sold. Unless... I sat up straighter, a memory surfacing. Grandpa Harry's collection of first editions, books that were prized precisely because they remained unchanged, from their original printing. And they were still in his house as far as I knew. I gathered my things quickly and drove to Burlington's East Hill neighborhood, where my grandfather's modest Victorian home stood on a quiet, tree-lined street. I'd been avoiding going there since the funeral, not yet ready to face the emptiness of the house without him in it. Using the key he'd given me years ago, I let myself in. The familiar scent, old books, pipe tobacco, and the lemon polish he'd always used on the wooden furniture hit me immediately, bringing a fresh wave of grief. I made my way to his study at the back of the house, where floor-to-ceiling bookshelves held his precious collection of first editions. He'd shown them to me many times over the years, explaining the history and significance of each volume, teaching me to handle them with care. Now, I stood before the shelves, studying them with new eyes. Which book might hold the secret of the brass key? There were hundreds of volumes, arranged by author and period. I remembered Grandpa Harry once telling me that his most valuable books were kept in a special cabinet to protect them from light and humidity. The cabinet was built into the wall behind his desk, its mahogany doors blending seamlessly with the surrounding paneling. I moved to the cabinet and tugged gently on the handles. Locked, as expected, but the keyhole was larger than would fit, a standard key. It looked like it might accommodate the brass key from the wooden box. Heart beating faster, I inserted the key and turned it. The lock clicked, and the doors swung open to reveal a dozen or so books, each in its own felt-lined compartment. These were the crown jewels of Grandpa Harry's collection, first editions of Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Steinbeck, and other literary giants. But one compartment contained something else entirely, a small leather-bound journal. I carefully removed it, noticing a note attached to its cover. For Jamie, the story behind the stories. All the answers are here. I sat in Grandpa Harry's leather chair and opened the journal. It was a detailed accounting of his investments over 5 decades, beginning with the purchase of the bookstore in 1971 and continuing through his most recent stock transactions just months before his death. The entries were meticulous, recording not just financial details but his thought process behind each decision. I learned how he'd used profits from the bookstore to buy commercial real estate in Burlington in the late 1970s, how he'd invested in Microsoft and Apple in the 1980s, and how he'd later diversified into biotech, renewable energy, and, most recently, artificial intelligence startups. But more revealing than the financial information were his personal reflections. Throughout the journal, he'd noted key life events and how they'd influenced his investment strategy. An entry from April 1985 caught my attention. Susan announced today she's marrying Richard and moving to Chicago. Can't say I approve. The man seems more interested in his career than in her or James, but it's her life to live. Decided to establish a trust fund for James that neither of them can touch. He'll need it someday, especially if my instincts about Richard prove correct. I was stunned. Grandpa Harry had been planning for my financial security even then, when I was just 7 years old, and his assessment of my father had been remarkably accurate. As I continued reading, a picture emerged of a man far more complex and forward-thinking than I'd realized. Grandpa Harry hadn't just been a kindly bookstore owner who enjoyed fishing and literature. He'd been a shrewd businessman with an uncanny ability to spot emerging trends and opportunities. The final entry, dated just 2 weeks before his death, brought tears to my eyes. Met with Edward today to finalize everything. The will, the trust, the video message, all set. I worry that Susan, Richard, and Melissa will make things difficult. For Jamie, once I'm gone. They've always seen money as something to be acquired rather than stewarded. Jamie is different. He understands value beyond dollars and cents. I've left him clues to find this journal when the time is right. Perhaps by then, he'll have begun to understand why I've chosen to leave my legacy in his hands. It's not just about the money. It's about continuing what I've built, about using these resources wisely and for the greater good. My time is growing short, but I face the end with peace, knowing that through Jamie, the best parts of me will live on. He has my curiosity, my love of learning, and most importantly, my heart. That's a legacy worth more than all the millions. I closed the journal, overwhelmed by emotion. The grandfather I'd known and loved had kept so much of himself hidden, revealing only now, after his death, the full measure of his wisdom and foresight. And with this new understanding came clarity about how to handle the situation with my family. I knew what I needed to do. Not just what Grandpa Harry would have wanted, but what aligned with my own sense of justice and compassion. I spent the weekend reading through the journal, absorbing its lessons, and formulating my plan. When Monday morning arrived, I felt ready to face whatever came next. Chapter 5. The Negotiation. Blackwell's conference room was imposing, with its long mahogany table and leather chairs arranged on either side like opposing armies preparing for battle. I arrived early, at Blackwell's suggestion, and we reviewed our strategy one final time. Remember, he advised, keep your emotions in check no matter what they say. This is business now, not family drama. I nodded, gripping the portfolio containing the documents we'd prepared over the weekend. Inside was my counteroffer, not what my mother had demanded, but something I believed was fair and in keeping with Grandpa Harry's values. At precisely 10 a.m., the conference room door opened. My mother entered first, looking polished in a navy suit, her expression carefully neutral. Behind her came a woman I assumed was Patricia Simmons, tall, angular, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. To my surprise, my father followed, his familiar bulk filling the doorway, his salt and pepper hair cropped shorter than I remembered. Richard, Blackwell acknowledged with a nod. I wasn't aware you'd be joining us today. My father gave a tight smile. Last-minute decision. Thought it would be good to have all parties present. All parties except Melissa, I noted. Your sister has exams this week, my mother explained, taking a seat across from me. She's given me authority to represent her interests, Blackwell gestured to the chairs. Shall we begin? For the next 20 minutes, Patricia Simmons presented what she called a reasonable compromise, essentially the same three-way split my mother had proposed in my apartment, dressed up in legal terminology and presented as a generous concession on their part. We believe this distribution honors the spirit of family unity while acknowledging James's special relationship with his grandfather, Simmons concluded, sliding a document across the table. We're prepared to formalize this agreement today, avoiding any unnecessary legal proceedings. Blackwell glanced at me, then addressed Simmons directly. Before we respond to your proposal, I'd like to clarify a few points. Are you aware that Harold Harrington established a family trust 5 years ago? A flicker of uncertainty crossed Simmons's face, quickly masked. My mother and father exchanged glances. "We were informed of a modest trust," my mother said carefully, "but its value is negligible compared to the full estate." $5 million is hardly negligible, Blackwell countered, removing a document from his folder and passing copies to each of them. "This is a summary of the Harold J. Harrington Family Trust, established in 2019. As you can see, it names all 4 family members as equal beneficiaries." My father leaned forward, scanning the document. "This says we each get income distributions, quarterly, with the principal to be divided upon certain conditions." He looked up sharply. "What conditions?" Blackwell smiled thinly. "I was just coming to that. Please turn to page 3, section 4.2. There was silence as they read the critical provision. "Distributions of principal to any beneficiary shall be contingent upon said beneficiary's acceptance of the terms of my last will and testament without contest or challenge." My mother was the first to understand the implications. Her face paled slightly. "This means if we contest the will, you forfeit your share of the trust," Blackwell confirmed. "Yes, that's correct. Harold was quite clear about this provision." Patricia Simmons recovered quickly. "This is clearly an attempt to coerce compliance with an inequitable will. Such in terrorem clauses can be challenged on public policy grounds in many jurisdictions." "But not in Vermont," Blackwell replied calmly. "As I'm sure you're aware, our state courts have consistently upheld the validity of no contest provisions, particularly when, as in this case, the testator has provided reasonable alternative benefits to potential contestants." Simmons conferred quietly with my mother and father while Blackwell and I waited. The atmosphere in the room had shifted. What had begun as an aggressive negotiation from a position of perceived strength had suddenly turned uncertain. Finally, Simmons looked up. "Even accounting for the trust, our clients still believe a more equitable distribution of the main estate is appropriate. James has no moral right to such a disproportionate share." "Actually," I said, speaking for the first time since the meeting began, "I have a counter-proposal." All eyes turned to me as I removed my own document from the portfolio and passed copies around the table. "I've given this a lot of thought over the weekend," I began. "While Grandpa Harry was clear about his wishes, I also recognize that family relationships are complex, and money can heal or harm depending on how it's handled." My mother's expression was guarded but attentive. My father looked surprised, as if he hadn't expected me to take an active role in the negotiations. "My proposal is this. I'll establish a new family foundation with $20 million from my inheritance, the Harold Harrington Foundation, for education and literacy. The foundation will be governed by a board consisting of all 4 of us, plus Mr. Blackwell as an independent director. Each year, the foundation will distribute grants to support literacy programs, educational opportunities, for underprivileged students and the preservation of independent bookstores, causes Grandpa Harry cared deeply about." I continued, outlining the structure and governance of the proposed foundation, the annual distribution requirements, and how decisions would be made. "Additionally, I'll establish separate trusts of $3 million each for Mom, Dad, and Melissa, funds that will be released in annual installments over 10 years, contingent upon active participation in the foundation's work. This is in addition to your shares of the existing family trust." I paused, looking directly at my mother. "This isn't about buying you off or silencing your claims. It's about honoring Grandpa Harry's legacy in a way that includes all of us, while respecting his wish that I be the primary steward of his estate." Silence followed my presentation. My mother's expression was unreadable, but my father looked thoughtful, stroking his chin in a familiar gesture. Patricia Simmons recovered first. "While we appreciate the creativity of this proposal, it still leaves James with a significantly larger share of the estate." "Yes, it does," I acknowledged without apology. "That was Grandpa Harry's explicit wish, and I intend to honor it." But my proposal creates meaningful benefits for everyone while avoiding a costly and divisive legal battle that would ultimately benefit no one except the attorneys involved. I smiled slightly at Simmons, who had the grace to look uncomfortable. "May we have some time to consider this?" my mother asked, her voice carefully controlled. Blackwell nodded. "Of course. We'll give you the room. There's coffee and water on the sideboard." Once outside in the hallway, Blackwell turned to me with an appraising look. "That was well done, James. The foundation idea is inspired. It honors your grandfather's values while giving your family a stake in his legacy beyond just money." I got the idea from his journal, I admitted. He wrote about wanting to establish something like this eventually, but never got around to it. It feels right to do it for him. "I think he'd be proud," Blackwell said quietly. We waited nearly 40 minutes before Simmons emerged to invite us back into the conference room. My mother and father sat side by side, their expressions serious but no longer hostile. "We've discussed your proposal," my mother began, "and we're prepared to accept it with a few modifications." The modifications were relatively minor: higher annual distributions from the individual trusts in the early years, some adjustments to the foundation's governance structure, and a formal role for my mother in selecting grant recipients for literacy programs. "These terms are acceptable," I said after consulting briefly with Blackwell. "I'll have the necessary documents drawn up this week." "There's one more thing," my father said, surprising me. "We would like a formal apology from James for implying that we didn't care about Harold, or that we're only interested in his money." I felt a surge of indignation. "I never said—" Blackwell placed a warning hand on my arm, and I stopped mid-sentence. "I think what Richard means," Blackwell suggested smoothly, "is that emotions have run high on all sides during this difficult time, and perhaps a fresh start would benefit everyone." My father nodded reluctantly. "Something like that, yes." I took a deep breath, thinking of Grandpa Harry's journal and his observations about my parents. I could argue, point out the years of neglect, the missed opportunities to visit him, the phone calls that became increasingly rare, but what would that accomplish now? "I apologize if I've given the impression that I don't value our family relationships," I said carefully. "Grandpa Harry's death has been difficult for all of us, and grief can make us say things we don't mean. I hope this agreement can be the beginning of a new chapter for our family, one where we honor his memory through our actions rather than our words." It wasn't exactly the apology my father had wanted, but it was the best I could offer with sincerity. After a moment, he nodded. "That'll do," he said gruffly. "Let's get this finished so we can all move forward." The details took another hour to hash out, but by early afternoon, we had a framework agreement that everyone could live with. Blackwell would prepare the formal documents for signing later in the week. As the meeting concluded, my mother lingered while my father and Simmons gathered their things. "James," she said quietly, "I want you to know, your grandfather loved you very much, more than any of us, I think. I didn't always understand their relationship, but I respected it." The admission surprised me. "Thank you for saying that." She hesitated, then added, "The foundation is a good idea. Dad would have liked it." It wasn't an apology for her threats or demands, but it was something. An acknowledgement, perhaps, that Grandpa Harry's choices hadn't been as arbitrary or unfair as she'd initially claimed. As I watched them leave, I felt a strange mixture of emotions: relief that the confrontation was over, satisfaction with the resolution we'd reached, but also a lingering sadness for the relationships that had become so strained that it took money to bring us together again. Blackwell must have sensed my mood. "This is a good outcome, James. Better than most inheritance disputes end. Give it time." I nodded, gathering my papers. "I should get back to campus. I have a class at 3. "You're going to teach? Today?" Blackwell seemed surprised. "Life goes on," I said with a small shrug. "Besides, Grandpa Harry always said that work was the best antidote to worry." Blackwell smiled. He was a wise man. Go teach your students, James. We'll finalize everything in the next few days. As I drove back to campus, my mind was already shifting to the lecture I needed to deliver on Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby and its critique of the American dream. The irony wasn't lost on me. In less than a week, I'd gone from a modestly paid literature professor to one of the wealthiest people in Vermont, all while negotiating family dynamics corrupted by the promise of money. Gatsby would have understood perfectly. Part 2. The Legacy. Chapter 6. The Transition. The December snow fell in thick, lazy flakes, coating Burlington in a pristine blanket of white that muffled sound and transformed the familiar landscape into something magical. From my office window at Champlain College, I watched students hurrying along the pathways, heads bent against the gentle onslaught, their colorful winter gear bright against the monochrome backdrop. 6 weeks had passed since the meeting with my family and their attorney. True to his word, Blackwell had prepared all the necessary documents, and within days, everything had been signed, notarized, and filed. The Harold Harrington Foundation for Education and Literacy was officially established, with an initial endowment of $20 million. The individual trusts for my mother, father, and sister were likewise set up, with the first distributions scheduled for January. The media, thankfully, had shown little interest in the story. A brief mention in the Burlington Free Press noted the establishment of the foundation and its mission, but without delving into the family dynamics behind it. Blackwell had been masterful in managing the public aspects of the inheritance, ensuring that Grandpa Harry's privacy, and mine, was maintained. My daily life had changed remarkably little, considering the dramatic shift in my financial circumstances. I continued teaching my classes, meeting with students, and working on the journal article I'd been writing before Grandpa Harry's death. The only visible difference was that I'd moved from my small apartment to a converted carriage house on the edge of town, a property with character and privacy, but not ostentatious. I'd also finally replaced my Japanese tin can as Grandpa. Harry had called my reliable but aging Honda with a modestly upscale Volvo. No Ferrari or Lamborghini for me, just a well-built car that would handle Vermont winters with ease. The most significant changes were internal. I found myself thinking differently about money, time, and purpose. The weight of responsibility that came with Grandpa Harry's fortune wasn't burdensome exactly, but it was ever present. His journal, which I'd now read cover to cover several times, provided guidance, but ultimately, the decisions were mine to make. A knock at my office door interrupted my thoughts. "Come in," I called, turning from the window. The door opened to reveal Elena Diaz, one of my most promising graduate students. She clutched a manila folder in one hand and a takeout coffee cup in the other. "Professor Harrington, do you have a minute? I've revised that chapter we discussed last week." "Of course, Elena. Have a seat." I gestured to the chair across from my desk. As she settled in, unwinding her scarf and placing her coffee on the edge of my desk, I was struck again by her quiet intensity. Elena was 30, older than most graduate students, having returned to academia after a career in publishing. Her thesis on environmental themes in contemporary American literature was shaping up to be exceptional. "I took your suggestion about reconnecting Carson's Silent Spring to modern climate fiction," she said, opening the folder. "It actually opened up a whole new direction for my analysis." For the next half hour, we discussed her work, exploring connections between literary environmentalism of the 1960s and today's cli-fi genre. It was the kind of academic conversation I loved, intellectually stimulating, passionate without being combative, driven by genuine curiosity rather than ego. As our meeting wound down, Elena hesitated, then asked, "Have you given any more thought to the department chair position? Dr. Wilson is still hoping you'll reconsider." I smiled ruefully. The chair of the English department, Martha Wilson, had been trying to convince me to take over when she retired at the end of the academic year. Before Grandpa Harry's death, I'd been seriously considering it. The position would mean less teaching, but more administrative work, a trade-off I wasn't sure I wanted to make. Now, with the foundation to run and my inheritance to manage, the prospect seemed even less appealing. "I'm flattered by Martha's confidence," I said. "But I don't think it's the right move for me right now. I have some personal projects that will require significant attention in the coming year." Elena nodded, gathering her papers. "That's what I figured. Selfishly, I'm glad. It means you'll still be able to chair my thesis committee." After she left, I turned back to the window, watching as the snow continued to fall. Personal projects. It was a polite euphemism for the profound life changes I was still trying to navigate. Besides the foundation, I'd begun exploring other philanthropic opportunities, guided by Grandpa Harry's journal and my own interests. Last week, I'd met with the director of the Burlington Public Library to discuss funding and expansion of their literacy programs for adult learners. The week before that, I'd visited a struggling independent bookstore in Montpelier, similar to the one Grandpa Harry had owned decades earlier, to see if strategic investment might help it survive in the age of Amazon. These were small steps, cautious explorations of what was possible with the resources now at my disposal. But I knew that eventually I would need to make bigger decisions. Should I continue teaching, devote myself full-time to philanthropy, perhaps start a business of my own? The options were both liberating and paralyzing. My phone buzzed with a text from Blackwell. "Year-end tax planning meeting tomorrow at 2 p.m. Bring questions." Another aspect of wealth I was still adjusting to: the constant meetings with financial advisors, accountants, attorneys, and investment managers. Blackwell had assembled a team of professionals to help me manage the technical aspects of my inheritance. But even with their expertise, there was still much for me to learn and many decisions only I could make. I texted back a confirmation, then gathered my things to head home. The snow was falling more heavily now, and I wanted to beat the worst of the evening traffic. The carriage house was warm and welcoming when I arrived, thanks to the smart thermostat I'd had installed. I'd furnished it sparingly but with quality pieces, many of them from Grandpa Harry's house, which I still couldn't bring myself to sell despite maintaining a separate residence. After changing into more comfortable clothes, I poured myself a glass of the single malt Blackwell had introduced me to and settled into an armchair with the latest quarterly reports from the investment portfolios I'd inherited. The figures were still somewhat abstract to me, millions flowing in and out of various funds, stocks, bonds, and alternative investments. But I was learning, gradually making sense of the complex financial ecosystem Grandpa Harry had constructed over decades. My phone rang, displaying my sister's number. Melissa and I had spoken more in the past 6 weeks than in the previous 2 years combined. "Hey, Mel," I answered, setting aside the reports. "James, hi. Am I catching you at a bad time?" Her voice was hesitant, still adjusting to our evolving relationship. "Not at all. Just reviewing some investment stuff. What's up?" "I wanted to talk to you about the Foundation's first board meeting next month. Mom mentioned you're thinking of focusing on rural literacy programs for the initial grants?" "It's one of the areas I'm exploring, yes. Grandpa Harry was particularly concerned about educational opportunities in rural communities." "That makes sense," she said. "I actually have some ideas about that. In my teaching practicum, we've been using this innovative peer-to-peer reading program that's shown amazing results, even in resource-limited schools." Melissa was in her final year of a master's program in education, training to become an elementary school teacher. It was a career choice that had surprised both our parents, who had envisioned something more lucrative for their youngest child. "I'd love to hear more about it," I said sincerely. "Maybe we could have lunch next week. I'll be in Boston for a meeting on Thursday." "That would be great," she replied, the enthusiasm in her voice genuine. "There's a place near campus that does amazing sandwiches." After we'd arranged the details, she paused. "James, I know things were weird at first with the inheritance and everything, but I want you to know I'm glad we're doing the foundation together. It feels like we're building something that matters. Her words touched me. Of all my family members, Melissa had been the least demanding about the inheritance, perhaps because, at 24, she hadn't yet developed the same expectations or resentments as our parents. I'm glad too, Mel. See you next week. After hanging up, I returned to the financial reports with renewed purpose. This wasn't just about managing money. It was about using resources thoughtfully to create meaningful impact, beginning with healing my own family relationships. Later that evening, as I was preparing for bed, my phone buzzed with an email notification from an unfamiliar address. Catherine.Fleming Burlington Press, com. The subject line read, Interview request, Ray, Harold Harrington Estate. My stomach tightened as I opened the message. Dear Professor Harrington, my name is Catherine Fleming, investigative reporter for the Burlington Press. I'm working on a feature article about significant estates in Vermont and their impact on local philanthropy. I've learned that you recently inherited a substantial fortune from your grandfather, Harold Harrington, reportedly in excess of $40 million, and have established a charitable foundation. I would appreciate the opportunity to interview you about this inheritance, your plans for the foundation, and the unusual circumstances surrounding your grandfather's wealth, which seems to have been unknown to most in the community, including some family members. If you're willing to speak with me, please suggest a time in the coming week. If I don't hear from you, I'll proceed with the information I've gathered from other sources, though I'd much prefer to include your perspective. Best regards, Catherine Fleming. I read the email twice, my initial alarm giving way to calculated concern. The reporter knew details that weren't public, the approximate value of the estate, and the fact that some family members had been unaware of Grandpa Harry's wealth. Someone had talked to her, but who? My mother? My father? One of the lawyers? Or perhaps a bank employee or someone else with access to confidential information? Regardless of the source, I needed advice on how to handle this. I forwarded the email to Blackwell with a brief message. We should discuss this before tomorrow's meeting. His response came within minutes. Agreed. Come an hour early. We'll strategize. I set my phone aside and climbed into bed, but sleep eluded me. The reporter's inquiry had disrupted the careful balance I'd been maintaining between my old life and new reality. While I'd known that complete privacy would be impossible, I'd hoped for more time to adjust before facing public scrutiny. Grandpa Harry's journal sat on my bedside table, and I reached for it now, seeking wisdom from his words. I flipped to an entry from 1993, the Burlington Business Journal called Today, wanting to profile me as a local success story. Declined politely. Publicity is rarely an advantage in business or in life. Those who need to know about my affairs already do. Those who don't, shouldn't. Better to work quietly and let results speak for themselves. The advice was characteristic of Grandpa Harry, practical, somewhat old-fashioned, and rooted in his belief in personal privacy. But was it still applicable in today's world of social, media, and information transparency? Could I realistically maintain a low profile while administering a multi-million-dollar foundation? These questions circled in my mind as I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, dreaming of newspaper headlines and family secrets laid bare for public consumption. Morning brought clarity, as it often did. Over coffee, I drafted a brief professional response to Catherine Fleming, neither accepting nor rejecting her interview request, but suggesting that I would be available to discuss the Foundation's mission and grant-making priorities at some point in the future, once its programs were more established. I then turned my attention to preparing for my meeting with Blackwell, reviewing my notes and questions about tax planning. If the recent weeks had taught me anything, I then turned my attention to preparing for my meeting with Blackwell, reviewing my notes and questions about tax planning. If the recent weeks had taught me anything, it was the importance of understanding every facet of the enterprise I had inherited. A foundation of this magnitude came with complexities I was only beginning to grasp. After organizing my thoughts, I closed my notebook and glanced at the grandfather clock in the corner of my study, a relic from Harry's office that I couldn't bear to part with. Its steady ticking had become a comforting soundtrack to my days. I had just enough time to change before heading downtown. The offices of Blackwell and Associates occupied the top 2 floors of Burlington's most prestigious office building, a gleaming glass structure that stood in stark contrast to the city's more traditional brick architecture. As I rode the elevator to the 18th floor, I reflected on how different my life had become in just 6 months. From a modestly successful academic with a comfortable but unremarkable existence to the steward of a fortune and a philanthropic enterprise that could reshape communities. The elevator doors opened to reveal a reception area that exuded exactly the kind of understated wealth that Grandpa Harry had always appreciated. Quality materials, classic design, nothing ostentatious or showy. "Ms. Calloway," the receptionist greeted me with a warm smile. "Mr. Blackwell is expecting you. May I offer you coffee or tea while you wait?" "Coffee would be lovely, thank you," I replied, settling into one of the leather armchairs. I hardly had time to open my portfolio before Richard Blackwell himself appeared. "Alexandra," he said, extending his hand. "Always a pleasure to see you. Please, come through to my office." Blackwell was a study in contrasts. His hair had gone completely silver despite being only in his early 50s, yet his face remained remarkably unlined. His manner was formal but genuinely warm, a combination that had made him Grandpa Harry's most trusted advisor for over 2 decades. His corner office offered a panoramic view of Lake Champlain, the Adirondack Mountains visible. In the distance on this unusually clear spring morning, we exchanged pleasantries as his assistant brought in coffee and then got down to business. "I've reviewed the preliminary reports from the investment team," Blackwell began, sliding a folder across his immaculate desk. "The portfolio is performing exceptionally well, particularly the technology holdings your grandfather acquired during the last recession. He always did have an uncanny sense of timing." I nodded, remembering Harry's axiom: "Buy when others are fearful, sell when others are greedy." Simple in theory, but it required both courage and foresight to execute. As for the foundation, Blackwell continued, "I've prepared several scenarios for the tax implications of different funding levels. The most tax-efficient approach would be to commit to a minimum 5% distribution annually, which aligns with federal requirements, but we have flexibility to increase that substantially in years when particular opportunities arise." For the next hour, we delved into the intricacies of foundation management, endowment strategies, grant-making structures, board composition, and compliance requirements. Blackwell was thorough, patient with my questions, and clearly impressed by how much research I'd done independently. "You're very much your grandfather's heir in more than just the legal sense," he remarked as we concluded. "He would be pleased by how seriously you're taking this responsibility." The comment warmed me, though I felt the weight of expectation it carried. "I'm trying to honor his legacy while finding my own path forward," I replied. "It's a delicate balance." Blackwell nodded thoughtfully. "Speaking of balance, there's one more matter to discuss." He hesitated, something unusual for the typically direct attorney. "I've received inquiries from several journalists about your grandfather's estate and the foundation. The Burlington Business Journal is just the beginning. Word is spreading about the size of the bequest." I sighed. "I suspected as much. Any advice on handling this?" "Harry's approach to publicity served him well in his time," Blackwell said carefully. "But foundations of this size inevitably attract attention. Complete opacity can sometimes generate more speculation than controlled transparency." It was essentially what I had been thinking earlier that morning. "So, you're suggesting I reconsider Catherine Fleming's interview request?" "I'm suggesting a middle path. Perhaps a brief press release about the Foundation's establishment, its general mission, and timeline for accepting grant applications. Enough information to satisfy legitimate public interest without turning yourself into a local celebrity. I considered this as I gathered my papers. I'll think about it. For now, I'd prefer to focus on getting the Foundation's house in order before inviting guests to inspect it. Blackwell smiled at the metaphor. A prudent approach. Just remember that in the digital age, information vacuums tend to get filled, not always with accurate content. With that sobering thought, we parted ways, and I headed to my next appointment of the day, lunch with Ellen Michaels, the nonprofit consultant I was considering hiring to help shape the Foundation's grant-making strategy. The Leahy Center for Lake Champlain was a deliberate choice for our meeting. Not only was it central and offered excellent local cuisine, but environmental conservation was high on my list of potential funding priorities. Ellen had suggested meeting there, which I took as a good sign of her understanding of both the local context and my emerging interests. I spotted her immediately upon entering the restaurant, a woman about my age with curly auburn hair pulled into a practical ponytail, dressed in a style that bridged professional and approachable. She rose to greet me with a firm handshake. "Alexandra, thank you for making time today. I've been looking forward to meeting you." "Likewise," I replied as we settled at a table overlooking the lake. "Your reputation in the nonprofit sector is impressive." Ellen laughed lightly. "Burlington is a small city. Stay in any field long enough and you'll develop a reputation, for better or worse. In your case, definitely for better," I assured her. 3 different people recommended you independently when I asked about consultants who really understand the local landscape. Our conversation flowed easily as we ordered and began our meal. Ellen had the rare ability to communicate complex ideas clearly without oversimplifying them. She spoke passionately about her work helping organizations develop strategic frameworks for social impact and asked thoughtful questions about my vision for the Foundation. "From what you've described," she said after listening to my preliminary thoughts, "you're considering quite a broad mandate: environmental conservation, education, affordable housing, arts, and culture. All worthy areas, but there's a strategic question to consider: depth versus breadth." I nodded, appreciating her directness. That's exactly the kind of guidance I'm looking for. I'm torn between focusing narrowly for greater impact and addressing a wider range of community needs. "It's the eternal dilemma in philanthropy," Ellen acknowledged. "There's no universal right answer. It depends on your goals, timeline, and the specific context of the communities you want to serve." She paused, considering. "Would you be open to a process that includes community input? Hearing directly from local leaders about priorities and gaps in current funding?" The suggestion resonated with me. "That sounds valuable, though I'm concerned about creating expectations we might not be able to meet." Ellen nodded appreciatively. "A legitimate concern. We could structure it as a learning process rather than an open call for proposals. Limited participation, clear parameters about the exploratory nature." By the time we finished our meal, I was convinced Ellen was the right person to help guide the Foundation's early development. We agreed on a 3-month initial engagement, beginning with an environmental scan of current philanthropic initiatives in the region and culminating in a strategic framework for our grant-making. As we were saying our goodbyes, Ellen hesitated. "May I offer one observation? Off the clock, so to speak?" "Of course," I replied, curious. "You strike me as someone who values privacy, which I respect. But philanthropy, by its nature, exists in the public sphere. Finding your comfort level with that visibility will be important, not just for you personally, but for the Foundation's effectiveness." It was the second time that day I'd received essentially the same advice. Perhaps the universe was trying to tell me something. "I'm beginning to realize that," I admitted. "It's an adjustment." Ellen smiled sympathetically. "For what it's worth, Thoughtful philanthropy that listens more than it pronounces is always welcome. The community will respect a deliberate approach, even if they're curious about the person behind it. With that insight to ponder, I headed back to my office at the small converted carriage house behind Harry's, now my Victorian home. The space was intentionally separate from my living quarters, a physical manifestation of the boundary I was trying to maintain between my personal and professional lives. My assistant, Marcus, looked up from his computer as I entered. In his late 20s, with a background in nonprofit administration and a master's in public policy, he'd proven himself indispensable in the short month since I'd hired him. "How were your meetings?" he asked, already reaching for the calendar to note any follow-ups. "Productive," I replied, setting down my portfolio. "We're moving forward with Ellen Michaels as our strategic consultant. Could you draft an engagement letter based on the proposal she sent last week?" "Already prepared," Marcus said with quiet efficiency, handing me a folder. "Just needs your review and signature. Also, there are several messages I thought you should see personally." He passed me a neat stack of message slips. The first was from Dr. Eliza Chen at the university, my former department chair, asking if I might consider funding a new environmental science scholarship. The second was from Mayor Winter's office, requesting a meeting to discuss potential partnership opportunities. The third was yet another journalist, this one from Vermont Public Radio. I sighed, running my hand through my hair. "The word is definitely out, isn't it?" Marcus nodded sympathetically. "The foundation registration is public record, and the amount is substantial enough to attract attention. Would you like me to prepare standard responses?" I considered the advice I'd received from both Blackwell and Ellen. Perhaps it was time for a slight adjustment to Grandpa Harry's philosophy. "Yes, but let's be thoughtful about this. For Dr. Chen, please set up a meeting. I want to hear more about the scholarship idea. For the mayor, a polite acknowledgement that we're still in the organizational phase but will reach out when we're ready to discuss community partnerships. For the media..." I paused, still conflicted. For the media, I decided. Draft a brief statement about the Foundation's establishment and general mission. Emphasize that we're in the early stages of developing our grant-making strategy and will announce application guidelines when they're finalized. No personal details about me or about the source of the funds beyond acknowledging Harry Calloway as the founder. "A middle path," Marcus observed with a slight smile. "Very diplomatic." "Let's hope so," I replied. "I'd like to review it before it goes out." With that settled, I turned to the stack of research reports on community needs assessments that had been compiled at my request. The foundation might be becoming more visible than I'd initially planned, but I was determined that its work would be grounded in careful research and genuine understanding of the issues it aimed to address. As the afternoon light slanted through the carriage house windows, I lost myself in data about affordable housing shortages, environmental challenges facing Lake Champlain, achievement gaps in local schools, and the economic struggles of rural communities in our region. Each issue seemed more pressing than the last, reinforcing both the privilege and the responsibility that had been unexpectedly thrust upon me. Around 6, Marcus gently interrupted my concentration. "Alexandra, you have dinner with your sister in an hour." I started, glancing at the clock. I completely lost track of time. "Thank you for the reminder." "That's what I'm here for," he replied good-naturedly. "The statement for the media is drafted and in your email for review whenever you're ready." I thanked him and began gathering my things, my mind already shifting from foundation business to family matters. Dinner with my younger sister, Natalie, was a weekly tradition we'd maintained even through the tumultuous months following Harry's death and the revelation of my inheritance. Our relationship had always been close, but not without complexity. As children, we'd bonded over the early loss of our parents. Our father to cancer when I was 8 and Natalie just 6. Our mother to a car accident 4 years later. Grandpa, Harry had raised us from that point, providing stability and affection, if not demonstrative warmth. Natalie and I had taken different paths as adults, me into academia, her into the arts as a ceramic artist with a growing reputation. She'd been genuinely happy for me when the inheritance was revealed, without a trace of resentment despite receiving a much more modest bequest. Still, I knew it had shifted our dynamic in subtle ways we were both still navigating. The farmhouse. Tap and Grill was bustling when I arrived, but Natalie had secured us a quiet corner table. Her face lit up when she saw me, rising to embrace me warmly. "Alex, I was beginning to think you'd stood me up for some high-powered foundation business," she teased, her eyes twinkling. "Never," I assured her, settling into my chair. Though I did lose track of time reading about affordable housing statistics, which tells you something about my exciting new life. Natalie laughed. "Only you could make managing millions sound like a research project." "That's exactly what it is," I insisted, "just with higher stakes than my academic work ever had." We ordered drinks, a local craft beer for Natalie, a glass of Cabernet for me, and fell into our comfortable rhythm of conversation. Natalie updated me on her latest commissioned pieces and an upcoming exhibition in Boston, while I shared edited highlights of my meetings with Blackwell and Ellen. "So you're actually considering talking to the press?" Natalie raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "That doesn't sound like the sister I know, or like Grandpa Harry's influence." I shrugged slightly. Times change. Even Blackwell thinks complete privacy isn't realistic for something of this scale. "Well, I'll be damned," Natalie said with a low whistle. The immovable Alexandra Calloway, bending to circumstances. "Adapting," I corrected primly, which made her laugh again. "Semantics." She took a sip of her beer, then asked more seriously, "How are you really doing with all this, Alex? We talk every week, but sometimes I feel like you're giving me the edited version." The question caught me off guard, though it shouldn't have. Natalie had always been perceptive, especially about emotional undercurrents I preferred to ignore. I began, then paused to consider my true answer. "I'm overwhelmed sometimes. Not just by the logistics, but by the responsibility. Every decision feels consequential in a way my academic choices never did." Natalie reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "You know you don't have to figure it all out at once, right? Even Grandpa Harry didn't build his business empire overnight." "I know," I acknowledged. "But he left this to me because he trusted my judgment. I don't want to disappoint him." "He's not here to disappoint," Natalie pointed out gently. "And from everything I know about Harry, he valued independence of thought above almost everything else. He'd want you to find your own way, not constantly worry about what he would have done." It was a perspective I needed to hear, and could only have accepted from Natalie, who had known Harry as intimately as I had, but had always maintained a healthy emotional distance I sometimes lacked. "You're right," I admitted. "I'm still finding the balance between honoring his legacy and creating something that reflects my own values and vision." "And you will," Natalie said with conviction. "Just give yourself time." She tilted her head, studying me. "Have you thought any more about bringing other voices onto the foundation board? It might help share some of that burden." I nodded. "It's on my list to discuss with Blackwell. The foundation documents allow for up to 7 board members, but I'm being cautious about who to invite." "Understandably," Natalie agreed as our food arrived. "But consider it sooner rather than later. Diverse perspectives can only strengthen the foundation's work." The conversation shifted to lighter topics as we enjoyed our meals. A local arts festival Natalie was helping organize, the book club I somehow still found time to attend monthly, and gentle gossip about mutual friends. It was a welcome respite from the weighty decisions that had dominated my days recently. As we were finishing dessert, a maple cream pie we'd decided to share, Natalie fixed me with one of her penetrating looks. "You know what I think you need? A personal project that has nothing to do with the foundation or your academic work. Something just for you." I laughed. When exactly would I fit that in? You'll make time for what matters, she said with a shrug. You always have. Remember when you were writing your dissertation and still managed to train for that half marathon? That was different. I was younger then. You're 38, not 80, Natalie said dryly. Just think about it. You've always defined yourself by your work. Now that your work has changed so dramatically, maybe it's time to explore other facets of who you are. The suggestion lingered in my mind as we parted ways after dinner. Natalie, heading to her studio for a few more hours of work. Me walking the 6 blocks back to my home, enjoying the mild spring evening. My house, still mentally tagged as Harry's house, even after 6 months, was a Victorian beauty on one of Burlington's historic streets, set back from the road and partially screened by mature maple trees. As I walked up the flagstone path, I tried to see it with fresh eyes. The porch swing where Harry used to sit in the evenings with his pipe, given up in his later years, but never without regret. The stained glass panels in the front door that cast jewel-toned light across the entryway on sunny mornings. The creaking third step that I kept meaning to fix but somehow never did, perhaps because its familiar sound was so much a part of coming home. Inside, I moved through my evening routine, hanging my coat, checking mail, making a cup of herbal tea, with the comfortable automaticity of long habit. Yet Natalie's words echoed in my thoughts. Had I become too defined by my work, first as an academic and now as a foundation director? Was there more to Alexandra Calloway than I had allowed myself to explore? I carried my tea into Harry's study, another space I hadn't been able to bring myself to redesignate as mine, despite having moved in my own books and replaced his heavy leather chair with one more suited to my frame. Settling at the desk, I opened my laptop to review the media statement Marcus had drafted. It was skillfully written, providing just enough information to satisfy basic curiosity without inviting deeper scrutiny. I made a few minor edits, then approved it for distribution to the journalists who had made inquiries, including Catherine Fleming at the Burlington Business Journal. That task complete, I found myself opening a new document, inspired by Natalie's suggestion about personal projects. At the top, I typed, "Beyond the Foundation, Personal Exploration Ideas." Then I sat, fingers hovering over the keyboard, surprisingly, blank. What did I want, separate from my professional obligations and responsibilities? What had I dreamed of doing before life took its unexpected turns? Slowly, hesitantly at first, then with growing enthusiasm, I began to list possibilities. 1. Return to playing the piano, abandoned in graduate school for lack of time. 2. Learn Italian, always intended to, especially after that conference in Florence. 3. Establish a serious vegetable garden. The south side of the property has excellent sun exposure. 4. Take sailing lessons on Lake Champlain. Harry had loved sailing, but I'd never learned. 5. Explore Vermont's Long Trail, perhaps in sections rather than one through hike. I sat back, studying the list with a mixture of excitement and skepticism. Each item represented a dormant interest, a path not taken due to the demands of career advancement or simple inertia. Were any of them truly calling to me now, or was this just an intellectual exercise? The piano, perhaps. I glanced toward the living room, where Harry's baby grand stood silent. I had played reasonably well as a teenager, finding emotional expression through music that I sometimes struggled to access directly. The thought of reconnecting with that part of myself was appealing, and the garden held genuine attraction. I'd always found a centered calm in working with plants, and the idea of growing some of my own food aligned with my environmental values. I added notes beside these 2 items, feeling a small but significant shift in my perspective. Perhaps Natalie was right. Finding parts of my identity beyond my professional role might help me navigate this transition with greater balance and clarity. With that thought, I closed my laptop and moved to the living room, lifting the cover from the piano keys for the first time in months. I played a simple scale, wincing at both the instrument's need for tuning and my own rusty technique. Yet even those imperfect notes felt like a statement of intention, a small step toward reclaiming parts of myself that had been set aside. I made a mental note to call a piano tuner in the morning and to ask Marcus to research local music teachers, who might take on an adult student returning to the instrument. Small beginnings, but meaningful ones. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect spring day that makes Vermont's long winters worthwhile. I woke early, as was my habit, and took my coffee onto the back porch, where the morning light filtered through newly leafed-out trees. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Media statement sent to all inquiring journalists as directed. Also, Dr. Chen confirmed for 2 p.m. tomorrow. Piano tuner scheduled for 4 p.m. today. Link to media coverage in your email when available. I smiled at his efficiency, then noticed a second message, this one from Natalie. Thinking more about our conversation, what if your personal project combined something you love with something that honors Harry? Just a thought. Love you. 3. Suggestion resonated immediately. Harry and I had connected most deeply through our shared love of literature. From my earliest memories, books had been the currency of our relationship. Gifts on birthdays and holidays, recommendations passed, back and forth, discussions over dinner that ranged from plot analysis to philosophical implications. In his later years, Harry had spoken often about the small local library in the rural Vermont town where he'd grown up, how it had opened worlds to him, provided escape during difficult times, and ultimately shaped his life's trajectory. He'd made regular anonymous donations to support its operations, never wanting recognition. I hadn't visited the Pearson Public Library since Harry's funeral, when I'd stopped briefly to leave a memorial donation. Perhaps it was time to reconnect, not as a major foundation initiative, but as a personal project that honored our shared values. The idea took root as I prepared for the day ahead. I could volunteer there personally, perhaps help modernize their systems or develop new programs. It would be hands-on engagement, separate from the Foundation's more strategic philanthropy. With renewed energy, I headed to the Carriage House office, where the day's schedule was already demanding attention. A conference call with the investment team, a meeting with the legal advisors about grant agreement templates, and endless emails requiring thoughtful responses. Yet, throughout the day, I found my thoughts returning to the Pearson Library and the potential personal meaning of engaging with it directly. By late afternoon, as the piano tuner worked his magic in the main house, I had made a decision. Marcus, I called from my office doorway, could you clear my calendar for Friday morning? I'd like to make a trip to Middlebury. He nodded, already, adjusting the schedule on his tablet. May I ask what's in Middlebury? Potential grantee site visit. No, I replied, realizing I felt lighter than I had in weeks. This one's personal. Friday morning found me driving south on Route 7, the Green Mountains rising to the east, farmland stretching to the west toward Lake Champlain. The familiar landscape, transitioning from urban Burlington to small towns and rural countryside, had always centered me. Today, it felt particularly symbolic of my own journey, moving between different worlds while staying grounded in this place that had shaped both Harry and me. Pearson was too small to appear on most maps, a blink and miss it. Village that had once been a mill town but now served primarily as a bedroom community for people working in Middlebury or Rutland. Its main street consisted of a general store, a post office, a white clapboard church, and the library, a red brick building from the early 1900s, funded by Andrew Carnegie's Library Initiative. I parked in the small lot beside the library and sat for a moment, gathering my thoughts. This visit wasn't official Foundation business, I reminded myself. I was here as Alexandra Calloway, Harry's granddaughter and a lover of libraries, not as the director of a multi-million-dollar philanthropic entity. The building looked much as I remembered it, well-maintained but showing its age, with tall windows and stone steps leading to a heavy wooden door. A sign proclaimed its hours, Tuesday, Saturday, 10 a.m., 6 p.m., and advertised a children's storytime program on Wednesday mornings. As I entered, the familiar scent of books, wood polish, and the slightly dusty warmth particular to old libraries enveloped me. The interior was a single large room with a mezzanine level, lined with wooden shelves and furnished with reading, tables, and comfortable chairs. Despite the technological changes of recent decades, it retained the essential character of the place Harry had described from his childhood. A woman in her 60s looked up from the circulation desk, her face brightening with recognition. "Alexandra Calloway, isn't it? It's been quite a while." It took me a moment to place her. "Mrs. Winters, you were the librarian when Grandpa Harry brought me here as a child." "Still am," she confirmed with a warm smile. "Though it's Margaret, please. I was sorry to hear about Harry's passing. He was a good man and a great friend to this library." "That's actually why I'm here," I said, approaching the desk. "I'd like to continue his connection to this place, on a personal level." Margaret gestured to a pair of chairs in a quiet corner. "Let's talk then. I've just put on a pot of tea in the back office." Over tea served in mismatched mugs, I explained my thinking, that while the foundation might support larger literacy or library initiatives, I wanted to maintain a direct personal relationship with the Pearson Library. "Harry would appreciate that distinction," Margaret said thoughtfully. "He was always clear about separating business from personal connections." "Exactly," I agreed, relieved at her understanding. "So I'm wondering what needs the library has that I might help with, either through volunteer time or modest personal funding, separate from any foundation consideration." Margaret considered the question. "We have practical needs, of course. Our computer system is outdated. The children's section could use refreshing, and the heating system is inefficient. But beyond those tangibles—" She paused, seeming to weigh her words. "What we really need is to reconnect with the community, especially the younger generation. When Harry was a boy, the library was the heart of Pearson. Now, with the internet, and all the competing demands on people's time, we're struggling to maintain relevance." The challenge resonated with me. "What have you tried so far?" "The usual programs, story time for little ones, summer reading for school-age children, a monthly book club for adults. They're modestly successful, but they're not bringing in new faces or creating real engagement." I thought about my own relationship with libraries throughout my life. As a child, discovering worlds through books. As a teenager, finding quiet. Refuge from social pressures. As a college student, using them for research. And as an adult, appreciating them as democratic spaces for community connection. "What if we approached this as community storytelling?" I suggested, the idea forming, as I spoke. Not just consuming stories through books, but creating and sharing local stories, oral histories, digital narratives, artistic expressions of what this place and its people mean. Margaret's eyes lit up. "An intergenerational project? Recording? The older residents' memories while teaching young people digital skills?" "Exactly," I said, my own enthusiasm growing. "We could create an archive that preserves local history while building connections across generations. The library would be both the facilitator and the repository." "I love it," Margaret declared. "But it would require equipment, training, coordination." "Those are things I could help with," I assured her, "through a combination of volunteer time and personal funding for necessary materials." By the time I left 2 hours later, we had outlined a 6-month pilot project. Pearson. Stories. Weaving our community narrative. I had committed to returning the following week to meet with the library board, and had a growing list of research to conduct about similar initiatives in other communities. Driving back to Burlington, I felt a sense of purpose distinct from but complementary to my foundation work. This project was personal, rooted in relationship and shared values rather than strategic philanthropy. It honored Harry while allowing me to express my own interests and skills. The weekend passed in a blend of foundation work. I couldn't entirely step away from the emails and reading, and personal rejuvenation. I spent an hour at the piano each day, clumsily at first, but with growing confidence, working through simple pieces I'd once played with ease. I researched community storytelling initiatives and digital oral history projects, and began making notes for the library board presentation. And I spent time in the garden, assessing the south-facing plot that had been ornamental in Harry's time, but could be converted to vegetables and herbs. The physical labor of turning soil and planting beds was therapeutic, grounding me literally and figuratively. By Monday morning, I felt more balanced than I had in months, ready to approach the foundation work with renewed clarity. Marcus noticed the change immediately. "You seem refreshed," he observed as we reviewed the week's schedule. "The Middlebury trip was beneficial?" "Very," I confirmed. "It's becoming a personal project, the Pearson Library Community Storytelling Initiative." I briefly explained the concept, emphasizing that it was separate from foundation business. Though there might eventually be broader applications for the foundation's work in rural libraries, Marcus noted thoughtfully. "Possibly," I acknowledged. "But for now, it's important to me to keep this in a different mental category." Marcus nodded his understanding, then shifted to business matters. "Catherine Fleming from the Burlington Business Journal has requested a follow-up conversation. She appreciated the statement but has more specific questions about the Foundation's focus areas and timeline." I considered this, remembering the advice from both Blackwell and Ellen about controlled transparency. "Schedule a brief phone call, 15 minutes maximum. I'll discuss our general approach and timeline, but no specifics about funding priorities until those are formalized." "Very good," Marcus made the note. "Also, the Vermont Community Foundation has invited you to join a panel discussion on the future of philanthropy in the state next month. 3 other foundation directors will be participating." This was more challenging. A public appearance would certainly raise my profile, but it might also establish the foundation as a collaborative player in the local philanthropic community, an important consideration for long-term effectiveness. "Accept provisionally," I decided. "Ask for more details about format, specific topics, and audience." The morning continued with its usual flow of decisions, communications, and planning. Around 11, Blackwell called with an update on the investment portfolio and to inform me that the IRS had officially approved the Foundation's 501c3 status. "Excellent news," I said. "That gives us the green light to move forward with program development." "Indeed," Blackwell agreed. "Have you given further thought to board composition? While you have legal authority to operate with yourself as the sole board member, a thoughtfully constructed board would provide both valuable guidance and a buffer between you personally and the Foundation's public-facing activities." "It's been on my mind," I admitted. "I'm thinking 3 to 5 members initially, with expertise in areas aligned with our likely funding priorities, plus nonprofit management experience." "A sound approach," Blackwell said approvingly. "I'd be happy to suggest candidates for your consideration, though I expect you'll want to conduct your own search as well." "Please do send suggestions," I said. "I value your perspective on this. And Richard," I added, using his first name deliberately, "I wanted to thank you for your advice about measured transparency. I think we've found a workable middle path." "I'm glad to hear it," he replied warmly. Harry valued privacy, but he also understood strategic engagement. You're honoring both aspects of his approach. After the call, I turned my attention to reviewing Ellen Michaels's initial environmental scan of the region's philanthropic landscape. Her analysis was thorough and insightful, identifying both well-funded areas and significant gaps in current giving patterns. Education received the most philanthropic dollars, but primarily for higher education, leaving K-12 innovations underfunded. Environmental initiatives focused heavily on conservation land acquisition, but neglected water quality and climate resilience. Affordable housing showed the largest gap between community need and available funding. The report confirmed much of my own research while adding valuable context about the strategies and priorities of other funders in the region. This would help us position the foundation to complement rather than duplicate existing efforts. As I made notes on potential focus areas, my phone buzzed with a text from Natalie. "Lunch tomorrow? Have news to share." I checked my calendar. I could move the meeting with the accounting team to later in the afternoon. 12:30 at Penny Clues? I texted back. "Perfect. See you then. It's good news. Stop looking worried." I laughed at how well my sister knew me, even via text message. Curiosity about her news provided a pleasant undercurrent to the remainder of my workday, which included the brief but cordial phone call with Catherine Fleming. True to my instruction, Marcus had scheduled exactly 15 minutes, but it proved sufficient to provide the journalist with the general outlines of our approach. A careful, research-based process to identify funding priorities, with initial grants likely to begin in the fall, focused on addressing needs in northwestern Vermont. "And what about your personal story, Ms. Calloway?" Fleming asked as our time was winding down. "Readers are interested in the person behind the foundation." "The foundation isn't about me," I replied firmly. "It's about effective philanthropy to strengthen our community. I prefer to keep the focus there." Fleming pressed gently. "But your background as an academic, your relationship with your grandfather, these provide context for the foundation's values and approach." I considered how Harry might have responded. He would have been polite but resolute in maintaining boundaries. "The foundation's values will be evident in its actions," I said. "I believe results speak more eloquently than personal narratives." Fleming seemed to recognize she wouldn't get more. "Fair enough. I appreciate your time, Ms. Calloway. We'll look forward to covering the Foundation's work as it develops." As I hung up, I reflected on how much easier that conversation had been than I'd anticipated. Perhaps there was a middle ground between Harry's strict privacy and the transparency expected in contemporary philanthropy. A professional visibility that kept the focus on the work rather than the person behind it. The Burlington Legacy. Part 2. The rainy morning gave way to scattered sun by noon as I made my way to Penny Clues Cafe to meet Natalie. The popular breakfast and lunch spot was crowded as usual, but my sister had already secured a table by the window and was sketching idly on a napkin when I arrived. "There's the philanthropist," she teased as I slid into the seat across from her, shaking raindrops from my jacket. "Very funny," I replied, though I couldn't help smiling. "So, what's this mysterious good news you couldn't share over text?" Natalie's face lit up with genuine excitement. "I got the Smithfield grant. A full year of funding to develop my new ceramic sculpture series." "Nat, that's incredible!" I exclaimed, reaching across to squeeze her hand. "The competition for that grant is fierce. I'm so proud of you." "I'm still in shock," she admitted, her cheeks flushed with pleasure. "It means I can scale back my teaching to just one class and focus on studio work. And there's an exhibition at their gallery next spring." We ordered lunch, ginger sesame noodles for her, a harvest salad for me, and spent the next half hour discussing the details of her project, an exploration of human nature interconnection through sculptural forms that combined natural and industrial elements. "Enough about my artistic adventures," Natalie said eventually. "How are things in Foundation land? Any progress on your personal project front?" I told her about the Pearson Library initiative, watching her expression shift from polite interest to genuine engagement. "Alex, that's perfect," she said when I'd finished explaining. "It honors Harry while letting you express your own passions, and it keeps you connected to a community outside the Foundation bubble." "That's exactly how it feels," I agreed. "Speaking of which, I've been thinking about what you said regarding the Foundation board. You were right. I need other perspectives, especially as we move toward actual grant-making. Natalie nodded thoughtfully. Have you identified potential members? I'm working on it. I want a mix of expertise related to our likely focus areas, plus strong nonprofit management experience. Blackwell is sending recommendations, but I'd value your thoughts, too. Me? Natalie looked surprised. I don't know anything about running foundations. No, but you know people, especially in the arts community. And you have excellent judgment about character, which matters as much as technical expertise. She considered this, then nodded. I'll think about it, actually. She paused, seeming to debate internally whether to continue. What? I prompted. Have you considered James Harrington? He chairs the Environmental Studies Department now, but he's done considerable work with conservation nonprofits. And he always spoke highly of your research. James Harrington had been a colleague at the university, though in a different department. We'd served on a sustainability committee together and had developed a mutual professional respect that might have evolved into something more had timing and circumstances been different. When I'd left academia after Harry's death, our contact had dwindled to occasional email exchanges and brief conversations at university events. I hadn't thought of him, I admitted. But you're right. His background would be valuable, especially if environmental conservation becomes one of our focus areas. And he's thoughtful, ethical, good at navigating complex situations, Natalie added, a hint of mischief in her eyes. Plus, other qualities I seem to recall you appreciating. I felt a flush creeping up my neck. This would be a professional relationship. Of course, she agreed, too quickly. Strictly professional. Board business only. You're impossible, I muttered, though without heat. Part of my charm, she replied cheerfully. Seriously though, Alex, it might be good to have someone on. The board who knew you before all this, someone who sees you as more than Harry Calloway's heir. Balance and perspective, you know? It was a fair point, and one I hadn't considered. Most of the names on my preliminary list were people I'd met through foundation research, respected nonprofit leaders, subject matter experts, community representatives. None had known me in my previous life as an academic. I'll add him to the list of possibilities, I conceded. But the board composition needs to be strategic, not personal. Of course, Natalie said, signaling for the check. Strategy first. Though I'm pretty sure even Harry would approve of board meetings having at least one person you actually enjoy talking to. We parted ways after lunch, Natalie heading to her studio, bursting with creative energy from her grant news, me returning to the office for the rescheduled meeting with the accounting team. As I walked, I found myself considering James Harrington more seriously as a potential board member. His environmental expertise would certainly be relevant, but more importantly, he brought a perspective grounded in both academic rigor and practical engagement with nonprofits. The fact that we had a pre-existing professional relationship could be an asset rather than a complication. By the time I reached the office, I'd decided to add his name to the list of candidates for further consideration. A strictly professional decision, despite Natalie's teasing. The afternoon passed in a detailed discussion of accounting systems and grant tracking procedures, necessary infrastructure but hardly inspiring work. By 5 o'clock, I was ready for a change of focus and decided to spend an hour at the piano. Before dinner. As I walked from the carriage house to the main house, my phone rang. An unfamiliar local number. Alexandra Calloway, I answered. Ms. Calloway, this is Will Bennett from the Lakeside Neighborhood Association. I hope I'm not interrupting. The name was vaguely familiar, though I couldn't immediately place it. Not at all, Mr. Bennett. How can I help you? I'll get right to the point, he said, his tone businesslike. Our neighborhood is facing a serious development threat, a luxury condominium project that would destroy historic properties and price out current residents. We understand your foundation has an interest in affordable housing and community preservation. Now I remembered. The Lakeside neighborhood had been in local news recently, a historically working-class area near the waterfront that was facing increasing gentrification pressure. The foundation is still in its organizational phase, I explained carefully. We haven't yet established formal application procedures or funding priorities. I understand, Bennett persisted, but time is of the essence. The zoning board hearing is next month, and we need resources to mount an effective opposition, legal representation, impact studies, alternative development proposals. I sympathized with their situation, but this was precisely the kind of pressure I needed to respond to carefully. Making exceptions to our still developing processes could set problematic precedents. Mr. Bennett, while your cause sounds worthwhile, I can't circumvent our governance procedures, which are still being established. What I can do is connect you with other funders who might be able to respond more quickly and keep your information on file for when our grant programs are operational. He didn't bother to hide his disappointment. By then, it could be too late. This neighborhood has been home to working families for generations. Once it's gone, it can't be recovered. The appeal was emotional and genuine, making my adherence to process feel coldly bureaucratic by comparison. Yet I knew that effective philanthropy required systems and strategy, not reactive giving based on whoever happened to call. I understand the urgency, I said, trying to balance empathy with boundaries. Let me suggest a couple of immediate steps. The Vermont Housing Conservation Board has an emergency preservation fund, and the Burlington Community Land Trust might be interested in the affordable housing aspects. I'm happy to make introductions to both. Bennett seemed slightly mollified by these concrete suggestions. Any connections would be appreciated, and I hope you'll consider visiting Lakeside yourself to see what's at stake. I agreed to the introductions and tentatively to a neighborhood tour, though I made no promises about funding. As I ended the call, I felt the tension between immediate community needs and the deliberate strategic approach we were trying to build. Was I hiding behind process to avoid making difficult decisions, or was I appropriately establishing professional boundaries for a foundation that aimed to be effective over the long term? These questions lingered as I moved to the piano, finding solace in the structured patterns of Bach. The familiar exercises gradually centered me, the physical discipline of correct fingering and timing, providing a welcome counterpoint to the ethical complexities of my new role. Later that evening, after a simple dinner, I drafted emails introducing Will Bennett to my contacts at the housing organizations, being careful to make no promises on their behalf. I then turned to my growing list of potential board candidates, adding James Harrington's name and notes about his qualifications. The list now included 8 names, a diverse group in terms of expertise, background, and perspective. From these, I would need to select 3 to 5 people who could work well together while bringing complementary strengths to the foundation's governance. As I reviewed the candidates, considering the balance of skills and viewpoints, I found myself creating scenarios of how different combinations might function as a working group. 3 seemed too few for adequate diversity of perspective, while 5 offered more robust discussions and shared workload. The question was, which 5 would create the most effective team? By midnight, I had narrowed the list to 6 finalists, with James Harrington among them. I would discuss these candidates with Blackwell and Ellen, seeking their insights before making final decisions. The Foundation's board would shape its culture and direction for years to come. This was not a choice to be made lightly. The remainder of the week passed in a blur of meetings, research, and planning. Ellen's environmental scan had identified affordable housing as the area of greatest unmet need in our region, with climate resilience initiatives and educational equity also showing significant gaps. These findings aligned with my own research and values, providing a natural focus for our initial grant-making priorities. Friday afternoon brought another meeting with Blackwell to discuss the board candidates and next steps in formalizing the foundation's structure. He had reviewed my shortlist and offered thoughtful perspectives on each candidate. "You've assembled a strong group," he said, leaning back in his chair. Particularly impressive is the balance between subject matter expertise and governance experience. That was intentional, I acknowledged. I wanted people who understand the issues we'll be addressing, but also know how to function effectively as a board. A wise approach, Blackwell nodded. If I may, I'd suggest prioritizing Dr. Rivera and Ms. Jackson from your list. Their combined experience in affordable housing from both the nonprofit and policy perspectives would be invaluable, given your emerging priorities. I made notes, appreciating his strategic thinking. And what about James Harrington? His environmental expertise seems relevant, but I'm concerned about bringing in someone I know personally. Blackwell considered this thoughtfully. Prior relationship can be either an asset or a complication, depending on the nature of that relationship and the individuals involved. In this case, I see potential value in having someone on the board who knew you before your current role. It provides continuity and perspective. It was essentially what Natalie had said, though framed more formally. As long as it doesn't create governance concerns, I noted. Establish clear expectations and boundaries from the outset, and it shouldn't, Blackwell assured me. Now, regarding timeline, I suggest extending invitations within the next 2 weeks, with an initial orientation session in late June. That would allow the board to provide input on grant guidelines before we announce the first application cycle in July. The plan made sense, creating a reasonable balance between moving forward and ensuring proper governance. We spent the remainder of the meeting reviewing legal aspects of board responsibilities and drafting the formal invitation letters. As the ESI meeting concluded, Blackwell paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. Alexandra, I've been impressed by how you've approached this responsibility. Thoughtful, strategic, and true to both Harry's values and your own. He would be proud. The unexpected personal comment caught me off guard, and I felt a sudden tightness in my throat. Thank you, Richard. That means a great deal, especially coming from you. He nodded, understanding the weight of his words and my response. Will you be at the Pearson Library tomorrow for the board presentation? Yes, I confirmed, grateful for the change of subject. I'm looking forward to it. It feels good to be personally engaged with a specific project, not just directing from a distance. Balance is important in this work, Blackwell agreed. The foundation is a marathon, not a sprint. With that wisdom in mind, I left his office and headed home, stopping at the garden center on the way to purchase seedlings for my vegetable garden. The weekend would be divided between foundation responsibilities and personal renewal, preparing. The library presentation, working in the garden, practicing piano, and perhaps reaching out to James Harrington to gauge his potential interest in the board before adding him to the final invitation list. Saturday morning dawned clear and mild. Perfect weather for the drive to Pearson. I arrived at the library with time to spare and spent a few minutes reviewing my notes before Margaret warmly welcomed me into the board meeting. The Pearson Library Board consisted of 5 community members, ranging from the retired high school principal to a young mother who ran the local farmers market. They listened attentively as I presented the community storytelling concept, asking thoughtful questions about implementation, sustainability, and community engagement. I especially appreciate that this isn't just another technology initiative, the retired principal commented. It's using digital tools to strengthen human connections and preserve our community's identity. Exactly, I agreed. The technology is just a means to an end. The real value is in the intergenerational relationships and the preservation of local knowledge. By the end of the discussion, the board had unanimously approved the pilot project, with a plan to launch in July. Perfect timing for capturing summer residents and visitors who had historical connections to the area. I committed to providing recording equipment, training for volunteers, and my own time for project coordination, all as personal contributions rather than foundation grants. As the meeting concluded, Margaret walked me to my car. "Harry would love this project," she said. "He always said the library was about stories more than books, the human connections that happen through sharing ideas and experiences." "He told me the same thing," I smiled, remembering Harry's frequent reminders that libraries were primarily about people, not collections. "I'll be back next Saturday to help set up the equipment and start volunteer training." The drive back to Burlington felt lighter somehow, my mind filled with practical planning for the library project rather than the weightier considerations of foundation strategy. This balance between professional responsibility and personal engagement was beginning to feel sustainable rather than overwhelming. Sunday was dedicated to the garden, transforming the ornamental southern plot into neat beds for vegetables and herbs. The physical labor was therapeutic, the connection to soil and growing things grounding in the most literal sense. By late afternoon, I had installed raised beds, amended the soil, and planted seedlings of tomatoes, peppers, lettuce, and herbs. The project was simple compared to the foundation's complexities, but the tangible results were deeply satisfying. As I cleaned up my gardening tools, my phone buzzed with a text from an unfamiliar number. "Alexandra, it's James Harrington. Heard through the grapevine you might be looking for foundation board members with environmental expertise. Happy to discuss if there's any interest. No pressure either way." The informal approach was characteristic of James, direct but not presumptuous. After a moment's consideration, I responded, "James, good to hear from you. Yes, we're in the process of forming the initial board. Would value the chance to discuss. Coffee sometime this week?" His reply came quickly. "Coffee sounds great. Tuesday morning at Muddy Waters, 10 a.m. I confirmed the time and place, then added the appointment to my calendar. The meeting would be exploratory, a chance to discuss the foundation's emerging direction and assess whether James would be a good fit for the board. The personal history between us would be acknowledged, but not centered. This was a professional conversation. Monday brought a fresh round of foundation work, reviewing the draft grant guidelines Ellen had prepared, interviewing candidates for the program officer position, and addressing the ever-growing volume of inquiries from potential grantees and community stakeholders. The most promising program officer candidate was Diane Chen, a 30-something professional with experience in both private foundation work and community organizing. Her understanding of how philanthropy could either reinforce or challenge existing power dynamics was particularly impressive, as was her commitment to meaningful community engagement in grant-making processes. The most common mistake foundations make is assuming they know what communities need without actually asking, she noted during our conversation, especially when there's a significant wealth or privilege gap between the funders and the funded. It was an insightful observation that aligned with my own concerns about maintaining genuine connections with the communities we aim to serve. By the end of the interview, I was strongly inclined to offer her the position, pending a second conversation with Ellen present to ensure alignment with our evolving strategy. Tuesday morning arrived with steady rain, not unusual for Vermont. In late spring, but inconvenient for my coffee meeting with James. I arrived at Muddy Waters a few minutes early, securing a quiet corner table away from the main traffic flow. The cafe was busy but not crowded, the ambient noise providing privacy without requiring raised voices. James arrived precisely at 10, shaking raindrops from his jacket as he entered. He spotted me immediately and made his way through the tables, his expression warm but professional. "Alexandra," he greeted me, extending his hand. "It's good to see you. It's been a while." "James," I returned the greeting, noting that he looked essentially the same as when we'd last met, tall and lean with prematurely silver hair that contrasted with youthful features, eyes that shifted between green and gray depending on the light. "Thank you for making time." "Of course," he replied, settling into the chair across from me. "I was intrigued by your message, and I've been following the news about your foundation with interest." We ordered coffee and spent a few minutes on General Ketchup, his work at the university, my transition from academia to philanthropy, mutual colleagues, and changes in Burlington's landscape. The conversation flowed easily, as it always had between us, but with the slight formality that acknowledged both our past connections and the professional nature of this meeting. When our coffee arrived, I shifted to the purpose of our conversation. So, about the foundation board. We're establishing the initial governance structure and seeking members with expertise in key areas, including environmental conservation and climate resilience. James nodded thoughtfully. From what I've read, you're still defining specific focus areas but leaning toward affordable housing, environmental initiatives, and educational equity? That's correct, I confirmed, impressed by his awareness. Ellen Michaels's environmental scan identified those as areas with significant unmet needs in our region. Ellen's excellent, James noted. I worked with her on the Lake Champlain Basin assessment a few years ago. This was a connection I hadn't been aware of, and it added another potential dimension to James's candidacy. The board will initially consist of 5 members, meeting quarterly with committee work between meetings. Terms would be 3 years, with the possibility of renewal. James listened attentively as I outlined the board structure, responsibilities, and timeline. When I finished, he asked several thoughtful questions about the Foundation's approach to grant-making, community engagement strategies, and how success would be measured. I appreciate your thorough explanation, he said finally. It sounds like you're being very intentional about building this from the ground up. Trying to be, I acknowledged. There's a significant responsibility in directing these resources effectively. James nodded, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. May I ask a somewhat personal question? Not about you, he added quickly, but about the Foundation's relationship to Harry's values. Of course, I said, curious about the direction he was taking. Harry Callaway was known for his business acumen and philanthropy, but also for certain traditional perspectives. How much flexibility do you have to establish the Foundation's values and priorities independently of his specific views? It was an excellent question, one that cut to the heart of my own ongoing internal dialogue about honoring Harry's legacy while establishing the Foundation as an entity that reflected contemporary understanding of social issues. The founding documents give me substantial latitude in determining specific programs and approaches, I explained. Harry established broad charitable purposes rather than narrow directives. That said, I do feel a responsibility to honor certain core values he embodied: pragmatism, emphasis on self-sufficiency, belief in education as a pathway to opportunity. But you're not bound to perpetuate his personal, political, or social perspectives, James clarified. No, I confirmed. The Foundation needs to respond to current realities and evolving understanding of what creates positive change. Harry himself adapted his thinking over time. I believe he would expect the Foundation to do the same. James seemed satisfied with this answer. That's helpful context. I wanted to be sure there would be room for evidence-based approaches that might challenge traditional assumptions about philanthropy. Absolutely, I assured him. In fact, that's one reason we're seeking board members with diverse perspectives and expertise to ensure we're not limited by any single worldview or approach. The conversation continued for another half hour, exploring specific environmental challenges in Vermont and potential philanthropic responses. James was knowledgeable, thoughtful, and clearly passionate about both conservation and climate justice issues. As our meeting drew to a close, I addressed the elephant in the room. Before we wrap up, I should acknowledge that we do have a prior professional relationship. If you joined the board, we would need to establish clear boundaries between that history and Foundation governance. James nodded, his expression serious. I appreciate your directness. I think we're both mature professionals capable of maintaining appropriate boundaries, but it's a fair consideration in your decision-making. It is, I agreed, though not the primary factor. Your qualifications and perspective are what matter most. We parted with a handshake and my promise to be in touch within 2 weeks as we finalized board selections. Walking back to my office through the persistent rain, I reflected on the conversation. James would bring valuable expertise and an important perspective to the board. The question was whether our prior connection, which had never quite evolved into a romance but had certainly contained elements of mutual attraction, would complicate the professional relationship we would need to establish. By the time I reached the carriage house, I had largely resolved that the professional benefits outweighed the potential complications. James would remain on the short list to be discussed with Blackwell and Ellen along with the other candidates. The remainder of the week brought progress on multiple fronts. Diane Chen accepted the program officer position and would start in 2 weeks. Ellen completed the first draft of our grant guidelines, focusing on the 3 priority areas we had identified. And Marcus finalized arrangements for my participation in the Vermont Community Foundation panel discussion, scheduled for the following month. Friday afternoon, I met with Blackwell and Ellen to make final decisions on board composition. After thorough discussion of each candidate's strengths and the overall balance of the board, we settled on 5 members. Dr. Maria Rivera, affordable housing policy expert and former city housing commissioner; Darren Jackson, executive director of a community development nonprofit focused on equitable housing; Dr. James Harrington, environmental studies professor with extensive nonprofit board experience; Lydia Washington, retired superintendent of schools. With expertise in educational equity, Robert Kim, financial advisor specializing in community development and impact investing. An excellent slate, Blackwell approved as we reviewed the final list. Diverse in expertise, perspective, and background, yet with complementary skills. I agree, Ellen added. They bring both depth in your priority areas and breadth in overall nonprofit governance. Now comes the important part, building them into an effective working group. That starts with the invitation and orientation, I noted. I want to be clear about expectations and establish a collaborative culture from the beginning. With that goal in mind, I spent Saturday drafting personalized invitation letters to each candidate, outlining both the general responsibilities of board service and the specific value I believe they would bring to the Foundation's work. Each letter concluded with an invitation to an individual conversation, followed by a group orientation session in late June. Sunday was divided between further work on the garden, an hour of piano practice, and preparation for my first volunteer session at the Pearson Library, scheduled for the following Saturday. The community storytelling project was taking shape, with equipment ordered and a training curriculum adapted from similar initiatives in other communities. By Monday morning, I felt prepared for the week ahead. Board invitations to be sent, grant guidelines to be finalized, and ongoing program development with Diane once she started the following week. The Foundation was moving from concept to reality, with structures and processes beginning to solidify. The responses to the board invitations came quickly. By Wednesday, all 5 candidates had accepted, expressing enthusiasm for the Foundation's emerging focus and approach. Individual conversations were scheduled for the following week, with the group orientation set for June 25th. James's acceptance came via email, professional in tone, but with a personal closing. I look forward to contributing to this important work, Alexandra. Thank you for the opportunity. It struck the right balance, acknowledging our existing relationship while maintaining appropriate boundaries for our new connection through the Foundation. As May turned to June, the pace of Foundation development accelerated. Diane brought valuable perspective and experience to her role as program officer, quickly establishing herself as a thoughtful partner in shaping our grant programs. The individual conversations with board members provided insights into their thinking and confirmed the potential strength of the group we had assembled. My personal projects continued in parallel, the garden flourishing with the longer days and warmer weather, my piano skills gradually returning with regular practice, and the Pearson Library initiative gaining momentum. The balance between professional Responsibility and personal engagement felt increasingly sustainable, each aspect enhancing rather than detracting from the others. The Vermont Community Foundation panel discussion in mid-June marked my first public appearance as the foundation's director. Alongside directors from 3 other foundations, I shared our emerging approach to addressing community needs, emphasizing research-based priorities and collaborative relationships with nonprofits and community leaders. The moderator, inevitably, raised questions about my personal journey from academia to philanthropy, which I addressed briefly, but directed the conversation back to the foundation's work rather than my own story. The approach seemed to work. Subsequent media coverage focused primarily on the foundation's priorities and timeline rather than on me personally. As June progressed, preparations for the board orientation intensified. Working with Blackwell and Ellen, I developed a comprehensive packet covering legal responsibilities, foundation mission and values, emerging program areas, and governance procedures. The goal was to establish both the formal structures necessary for effective oversight and the collaborative culture I wanted to characterize the Foundation's work. The orientation session itself, held in the conference room at Blackwell's offices, exceeded my expectations. The 5 board members engaged thoughtfully with the material and with each other, asking insightful questions and offering valuable perspectives based on their diverse experiences. James contributed actively but maintained appropriate professional boundaries, treating me as the foundation director rather than as a former colleague with whom he had a personal connection. His insights on environmental grant-making were particularly valuable, challenging some of our assumptions about the most effective approaches to conservation and climate resilience. By the end of the day-long session, I felt confident in the board we had assembled. Diverse in perspective but united in commitment to the Foundation's mission. The governance structure was established, with quarterly meetings scheduled and committee assignments distributed according to expertise and interest. With the board in place and grant guidelines finalized, we were ready to announce the Foundation's first application cycle, scheduled to open in July with grants to be awarded in September. The public announcement, crafted with input from the board, emphasized our focus areas, approach to partnership with grantees, and commitment to addressing root causes rather than symptoms of community challenges. The Burlington Business Journal covered the announcement with a thoughtful article that focused primarily on the Foundation's priorities and process, with only brief mention of my personal transition from academia to philanthropy. It was exactly the kind of balanced coverage I had hoped for, informative for potential grantees without sensationalizing the personal aspects of the story. As July approached, bringing the official launch of the Foundation's grant programs, I found myself reflecting on the journey of the past year, from inheriting Harry's estate to establishing a philanthropic entity that honored his legacy while reflecting my own values and vision. The Burlington Business Journal might have called it a local success story, but I saw it differently. It wasn't primarily about success, but about responsibility, the privilege and obligation of directing resources toward community benefit, in ways that respected both those who provided the resources and those they were intended to serve. Grandpa Harry's journal entry still resonated. Publicity is rarely an advantage in business or in life. Those who need to know about my affairs already do. Those who don't shouldn't. Better to work quietly and let results speak for themselves. I had found a middle path, not complete opacity nor unwarranted visibility, but a thoughtful approach to transparency that kept the focus on the work rather than the person behind it. The Foundation was becoming known for its priorities and process, not primarily as Alexandra Calloway's project or even Harry Calloway's legacy. As I tended my now flourishing garden on a warm July evening, watching bees move among the flowering herbs and vegetables beginning to form on vigorous plants, I felt a sense of alignment between my personal and professional lives that had been missing in the tumultuous months following Harry's death. The Foundation was established and functioning, guided by a strong board and dedicated staff. The Pearson Library Project was bringing joy and connection through direct community engagement. My piano playing was improving steadily, providing both challenge and solace. And the garden offered tangible, immediate rewards for attention and care. Natalie had been right. I needed all these dimensions to feel whole, not just the professional responsibility of the foundation. Harry had known this too, in his own way. His business success had been important to him, but so had his quiet personal pleasures, his garden, his books, his sailboat on the lake. The legacy he had left me wasn't just financial, but philosophical. A belief in balanced living, in meaningful work combined with personal pursuits that nourished the soul. In finding my own version of this balance, I was honoring his memory more truly than by simply preserving his specific approaches or priorities. As twilight deepened and I gathered a handful of fresh herbs for dinner, I felt a quiet contentment. Not the dramatic success story the Burlington Business Journal might have wanted to tell, but something more sustainable and ultimately more valuable, a life of purpose, balance, and authentic engagement with both professional responsibility and personal joy. The foundation would make its first grants in September, beginning the real work of contributing to community well-being. The true measure of success would come not in publicity or recognition, but in the changes that occurred in people's lives, and in the community's resilience over time. That was a story worth telling, one that would unfold gradually through actions rather than words, through relationships rather than press releases. It was Harry's approach, adapted for a new era, and a different personality, but grounded in the same core values of substance over appearance, results over recognition. As night fell completely, I went inside to prepare a simple dinner, looking forward to the board meeting the following day and the ongoing unfolding of this unexpected journey. As foundation director, community volunteer, gardener, pianist, sister, and individual finding her way through the complexities of privilege and responsibility, the Burlington Business Journal might still want their profile someday, and perhaps at some point I would agree, when there were results to share rather than just intentions to describe. For now, I was content to work quietly and let the foundation's actions begin to speak for themselves.